really looking forward to a thick day of retreat and big think reflection over the course of the day, starting with a conversation this morning that's going to stir the pot a little bit. We're going to be talking about Dr. Kermit Roosevelt's book, The Nation That Never Was, Reconstructing America's Story, which gets into it around the founding and ideas around Reconstruction. I want to say just a brief word about the person for whom this forum is named, who's a long friend of Pete Wehner's, a long friend of mine, who died in 2017 of pancreatic cancer. And you may have read a little bit about him, but just because this gathering is sort of convened in his honor. And he was a person who really loved young people and finding talent and helping the city. He was here faithfully as a vice president of Ethics Public Policy Center for like 35 years and was just a beloved friend to many. There is this compilation of tributes written by a bunch of journalists about Mike that you can find on the EPPC website. He was also funny. He told a story one time about working for Chuck Colson, one where he was got mugged by reality and fought back against the guys who broke into his hotel room and said, I need those ties for a meeting tomorrow. Like, leave me a tie, He would fight back. He also carried the cigarette for Chuck Colson when he'd have some meeting with a donor in Chicago, and donors would come around the corner, and he'd say to Mike, who was his assistant at the time, hold this, and Mike would be like, put it in his pocket. No, man, he'd sort of burn himself. He had a lot of stories that were clever and funny and a joy to hear about at gatherings. His wife Jenny will be joining us tonight, along with about 20 or so DC-based journalists, some of whom have schedules being adjusted because of the Trump trial. But he loved young people. He was open-minded. He was interested in faith that went deeper than politics, which is a subject that, again, Pete has been writing a good bit about recently, sort of faith first, that can help us make sense of the world. And of course, we're basically gathered at a time when institutional trust is quite low. Kermit has written a book that you might find a bit to be radical as we get into it, because he needs to make the case first. But we think that Faith Angle is the perfect place to sort of have a big think and get into it. So let me introduce these two speakers to you quickly, and then we'll have a conversation about whether our perception of the founding ideals of the country, equality, justice, opportunity, are fundamentally flawed in some way. Kermit Roosevelt is the David Berger Professor for the Administration of Justice at Penn, where he's focused on constitutional law and conflicts of laws. He has published a couple of scholarly books before this one with Yale Press in 2006 on judicial activism, another in 2010 on legal conflicts. He has published broadly the Virginia Law Review, Michigan Law Review, Columbia Law Review, a lot of peer-reviewed places. He's also written two novels, one called In the Shadow of the Law from Farrar Straus in 2005, and a second one called Allegiance in 2015. He was selected by the American Law Institute as the reporter for the third restatement of conflict of laws in 2014. So Kermit's going to speak first about the book Argument, and then Pete Wehner. Peter Wehner does many things, and many things well, as you'll soon hear. He was a speechwriter in the George W. Bush administration. He co-authored a beautiful book with his friend, long friend and colleague, the late Mike Gerson, in 2010 called The City of Man. The subtitle, Religion and Politics in a New Era. He wrote a book called Wealth and Justice in 2010. He wrote most recently a book in 2019 called The Death of Politics, How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump. Pete is today a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum, and he contributes regularly as an opinion writer at the New York Times, writes regularly as a contributing writer for the Atlantic. His works appeared at the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, National Affairs, and a lot of other places. So I just want to name quickly that Pete is a faithful friend to Faith Angle. He actually was the person that Mike asked to run it when Mike died. On his deathbed, he asked Pete to do it, and Pete kept it going strong for a year before pivoting back into a lot of intellectual work. So it's a real honor to have you both here. We're going to hear first from Dr. Roosevelt and then from Pete Wehner. Kermit, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really a privilege and an honor and a delight to be here. And thank you all for coming. So I'm going to try to give you, I guess, like half of the argument of the book, because we got another panel. So I'm going to do part of it now. And it's maybe useful to start by saying something about the problem that I think the book is trying to solve. Because this did start as sort of an intellectual exercise. Like I read the Declaration of Independence one day and it struck me in a particular way, and I was like, I wonder, what happens if I go down that path. But I ended up thinking of it as an attempt to solve a particular problem, which I would describe by saying our national story isn't working anymore. So what do I mean by that? Well, a national story, what I mean by that is a sort of agreed upon version of our history that is supposed to tell us who we are as a nation, as a people. And it's supposed to tell us what we should believe, what we should be willing to fight for, who our heroes are, the people we look up to, who the villains in history are, the people we look down on. And fundamentally, it is supposed to inspire us. It's supposed to call us together to make sacrifices in the name of shared ideals and our American identity. And my thesis is that we had a story that was doing this, and I think part of the argument is it never worked as well as some people thought. But we had the story, what I call our standard story, and now it's not working. It's not working because people today, particularly younger people, are rejecting it. They think that the story they're being told is not accurate, and if you make it accurate, it stops being inspiring. And then it doesn't work because the standard story is supposed to inspire. So what is this standard story? It should be familiar to you. This is what politicians say. If you listen to political rhetoric about who we are as Americans, you find it in lots and lots of presidential addresses. And the basic idea, the key for me, is this idea that our fundamental American values, by which I mean basically liberty and equality, are there at the beginning. In the founding, 1776, they're the seed from which founding America grows. They're the heart of this new nation. So they're stated in the Declaration of Independence. Most notably, all men are created equal, and also, inalienable rights, liberty, that stuff. And then they're fought for in the Revolution, so we got a war for these ideals. And then we've got the Constitution written in 1787, making them into our highest law, right? Taking these ideals about natural rights and equality, making them the force of law. And then American history is the story of progressively trying to make those ideals real. And it's supposed to be a story of progress, so we sort of admit there are steps back, but mostly it's steps forward. And the heroes are the people who champion those ideals, like Martin Luther King, 1963, March on Washington, I Have a Dream speech, saying, live out the full meaning of all men are created equal. And Abraham Lincoln, 1863, Gettysburg Address, saying we're a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And then, of course, Thomas Jefferson, 1776, writing those words. And the point of the standard story is continuity, right? We are the same nation with the same values at all of those moments. At each of those moments, Americans are coming together to fight for equality in the name of the Declaration of Independence. So the question is, does that strike you as convincing? Well, I don't know. And I went backwards in time. I was saying 1963, then 1863, then 1776, to try to make the transition a little less jarring. And I don't know how jarring it would have sounded to you if I'd said, our heroes are people who champion equality and liberty like Thomas Jefferson in 1776. And the degree to which I find it jarring has something to do with having thought sort of obsessively about this for 10 years or so. But my view now is Thomas Jefferson was really kind of a creep. So like we all know, I think when he writes all men are created equal, there's an enslaved person standing at his elbow. But more than that, he enslaved his own children. And I think that it is difficult to hold him up as an embodiment of American ideals if you want people to think American ideals are good. And that's the problem that I think we're facing now. This is a view that increasingly young people are holding. So we have this dilemma because on the one hand, right, we want to be truthful about our past. What's the point of just making up a story if it's not based in reality? But also, we want to be positive and patriotic, right? We don't want to teach children that America is bad. Because what's the point of that? Like, how can you have a nation if you're teaching your school children that it's bad? So that's the problem. What's the solution? One thing you could do is you could try to defend the standard story, and you could require teachers to teach it. And there's a Florida law that does exactly that. It says American history shall be presented as the development of a nation based on the universal principles of the Declaration of Independence, which bans my book. And you could try to exclude other viewpoints. You could ban the 1619 Project and other revisionist accounts. And that, I think, is a large part of what's going on with all the anti-CRT laws. So that, I think, is a bad idea, right? Because I'm not in favor of censorship, and I don't think it's going to work anyway. So in terms of where this book fits into all of the larger conflict that's going on, one thing that's going on is the founders are good versus the founders are bad. And I'm actually not trying to participate in that debate. I'm not saying the founders are good. I'm not saying the founders are bad. What I'm saying really is they're not our founders. Then there's another sort of broader debate, which is America is good versus America is bad. And I think that's sort of an oversimplification, and I don't think 1619 is saying America is bad. But if you understand it that way, America is good versus America is bad, I am definitely on the America is good side. What's radical about the book is the America that I'm saying is good is not quite the America that you might have grown up learning about. So to situate what I'm saying in terms of historical scholarship more generally, 80% of what I'm going to say, this panel, next panel, is kind of straight down the middle, accepted by mainstream historians. It's conventional wisdom very solidly supported by the historical research. And then 20% is kind of radical. And the 20% is really just, to me, things that follow pretty clearly from the accepted 80%, but that we haven't really been willing to accept until now. So here's one example of the radical 20%. The Declaration of Independence, as it's understood in 1776, does not contain our modern ideals of liberty and equality, and is not even inconsistent with slavery. So that might sound surprising. Nowadays, we certainly think of the Declaration as stating this broad principle of equality. We think of it as an anti-slavery document. And we think of that, think of it that way because we understand all men are created equal to mean something about how the government should treat people in society. It should treat them equally, or with equal concern and respect. And that's what Martin Luther King is saying in 1963, and it's what Abraham Lincoln is saying in 1863. But it is not what Thomas Jefferson is saying in 1776. So in 1776, the people who are writing, and most of the people who are reading the Declaration, understand the phrase all men are created equal as a shorthand invocation of Enlightenment social contract theory, which was the dominant political philosophy of Jefferson's day, widely understood, so well known that you could have this shorthand invocation, people would understand it, and you could put forward some of the broad claims as self-evident truths, which is what Jefferson is saying. And what it means to Jefferson and his contemporaries is, in a world with no government and no laws, no one would have a duty to obey anyone else. So it's about where legitimate political authority comes from. And it's saying if people just popped into being in a world with no government and no laws, there would be no legitimate political authority. So what's the point of that? It's a rejection of the divine right of kings. Because someone might say, King George might say, although in fact the British weren't maintaining this anymore, but someone might say, my authority comes from God, and you can never reject it. Right? If you rebel against the crown, you are not just a traitor, you are a sinner. Jefferson obviously doesn't like that because he's trying to make the case for independence. So he gets rid of the divine right of kings with this one phrase, all men are created equal. And the important point is that's all it means in Enlightenment social contract theory. And you can read John Locke's second treatise on government. The argument of the Declaration comes very directly from that. It's about the origin of legitimate political authority. It's about how governments come into being. It doesn't mean that once a government is created, it has to treat people equally. There is stuff in the preamble about how governments have to act, and we'll probably talk about that later. But doesn't mean they have to treat people equally. It doesn't mean that for the insiders, the people who come together and form the government and give it its authority from their consent, and it definitely doesn't mean that for the outsiders, people who are not part of the political community. And that's why it's actually philosophically consistent for the colonists to simultaneously say, King George is trying to make us into slaves. That's a terrible thing, right? And it is a terrible thing because the government is supposed to protect the rights of the people who form it. And they can also say, King George is inciting insurrections among the people we enslave. That's a terrible thing. Slavery is okay, or at least not categorically impermissible if you're enslaving outsiders, people who are not members of your political community. And I'll talk more about the insider-outsider line later. But let me just tell you a little more about this claim, because the historians who have studied the Declaration and its context agree with, as I said, about 80% of what I just told you. So they agree about the social contract theory. They agree this comes from Locke. They agree that it's about the state of nature. They just also seem to assume that it's this broad moral principle about equality within society. But I've never heard a very good explanation for why Jefferson would say that. And if you think about it from the perspective of 1776, it seems very unlikely that either he or his readers thought he was doing that. So one, does it make sense to start with a principle that criticizes slavery? No, because that brands the colonists as wrongdoers. And two, what would happen if Jefferson wrote a passage that criticized slavery? Well, we kind of know, because he wrote a passage that criticized not the slavery practiced by the American colonists, which would be counterproductive, but the international slave trade, which he thought he could pin on King George. And the Continental Congress took that out because it hit too close to home. So if they take that out, does it make any sense that they would leave in as the first self-evident truth the principle that criticizes slavery? Probably not. And if they had, it would have been controversial. And again, the historical evidence on this is good. If you look at the reception of the Declaration in 1776 and following years, people didn't pay a lot of attention to the preamble. They didn't think all men are created equal was significant, which they would have if it was this novel, broad moral principle. So I'm saying the Declaration didn't have the ideals that we now find in it, which makes it seem unlikely that the Revolution was a war for this concept of equality under law. And if you look at the Revolution in the context of slavery, you can kind of see this. So what's going on with the Revolution and slavery? Well, neither side is fighting to end slavery. And we want to say, right, the Revolution is ideologically a war against slavery. Gordon Wood, famous historian, says, slavery was practiced everywhere without substantial criticism until the American Revolution made it a problem for the world. But this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What's happening during the Revolution? Neither side is fighting to end slavery. It's not an abolitionist war. But the British are undoing slavery where it's convenient for them. And they are arming the formerly enslaved. And they are dressing them in uniforms with sashes that say liberty to slaves. And the Americans are saying, in response, this is about the worst thing you could ever do. So there's a member of Parliament, a man named David Hartley, who proposes to Benjamin Franklin and also on the floor of the House of Commons, here's a way to end the war. We will repeal all of the acts passed after the French and Indian War, all of these taxes that the colonists hate so much, in exchange for one thing, which is you, the colonists, promise to give enslaved people a right to trial by jury as a first step towards abolition, which is his goal. He's unambiguous about that. Abolish slavery everywhere. And Benjamin Franklin, who is one of the best founders, I think, way better than Thomas Jefferson, invented swimming flippers, lots to like about Franklin. Franklin writes back and says, by inciting slave rebellions, you have proven yourselves unworthy to rule us. There is no going back from that. Now, whenever I say things like this, I do get pushback. And I benefit from pushback because it makes me look into things more. And I learn from that. So people say to me, come on, even in those early years, there were some people who understood the Declaration differently. And that's true, right? I looked into it. The important question, though, is who are those people? Are they the founding fathers, or are they more the dissenters and outsiders? in founding America. And you can get a sense of that by, one, looking at the documents where the colonists speak with one voice. Like, what can all the 13 states agree on? So that would be the Declaration of Independence, which does, at the end, you probably know, have this complaint that King George is inciting rebellions among the people the colonists enslave. Or the Treaty of Paris, which ends the revolution, where one of the conditions is that the British will depart North America without carrying away, in quotes, the treaty says, any Negroes or other property of the inhabitants. Right? So that's what the states think about slavery. The British must give back the people that they have given freedom to. And the British, to their credit, defy that treaty obligation. They keep their promise to the formerly enslaved, and the American diplomats pursue that for years, demanding compensation. Or you could get a sense of it by looking at the correspondence between Benjamin Banneker, a free black man, and Thomas Jefferson. So Banneker writes Jefferson in 1791 saying, here are some astronomical calculations that you might find interesting, and by the way, don't you think all men are created equal means slavery is wrong? Asks him that exact question. And Jefferson writes back, he expresses polite enthusiasm for the astronomy and says not a word about all men are created equal. And actually, Jefferson never again used that phrase in any letter, speech, diary, or essay that we have found. Like, we've got a lot of stuff digitized. You can do the word searches. He never used it. Neither did John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Dolly Madison, Alexander Hamilton, or John Jay. They just didn't use that phrase. You can look at 26 volumes of letters of the delegates to Congress from the years 1774 to 1789, and there are a few uses of the phrase right before July 4th, 1776, where they're talking about the Declaration of Independence, and zero afterwards. So in terms of the meaning and the significance of all men are created equal, the people pushing this broad understanding in founding America are really the outsiders. Then the last part of the standard story, Constitution written in 1787. This has really nothing to do with the natural rights that the Declaration of Independence is talking about. So the 1787 Constitution has no provisions that protect individuals from other individuals, which is what you do if you're a government trying to protect natural rights. Right? As the Declaration of Independence says, you got your natural rights, they're not secure, other individuals might interfere with them, and that's what governments are supposed to protect you from. So the Constitution doesn't protect individuals. The national government that the Constitution creates doesn't do that either. Congress could not then, Congress in fact cannot now, pass a law that just makes it a crime for one American to kill another. So the most basic protection of your natural rights, protection of your life, is actually beyond the power of the federal government, except in some special situations that make it an issue of federal concern. And that's because the 1787 Constitution, to an extent that we've really kind of forgotten, is not about individual rights. It's about interstate cooperation. It's about making the states pull their weight. It's about international relations. But for most individual to individual interactions, whether one person is violating another person's natural rights is just not a matter of federal concern. It's all left up to the states, except for the issue of slavery. So that's a violation of natural rights that the Constitution pays attention to, not because it's concerned about liberty, but because it's concerned about interstate friction. Right? Slavery is a source of interstate friction. And the Constitution reacts to that friction by trying to manage it. And it manages it mostly by rewarding and protecting slavery. So it protects the international slave trade until 1808. It abridges free state sovereignty by requiring them to return fugitives. And it tilts the whole national government in a pro-slavery direction with the Three-Fifths Compromise. So directly, this means that slave states get more representatives because they can count 3/5 of their enslaved population. Then, because a state's number of electors is determined in part by its number of representatives, slave states get extra voice in the selection of the president. And then, because the president appoints judges, you get a pro-slavery bias in the judiciary. So that's the Three-Fifths Compromise. And one more thing. The 1787 Constitution contains a rule that Congress can't ban slavery in the territories and that black people can never be United States citizens. Now, I say that and then depending on the audience, like depending on how much constitutional law you know, some people react, wait, that's not the Constitution, that's what the Supreme Court said in Dred Scott. And everyone knows that Dred Scott is wrong. And first, yes, that is Dred Scott. So it's not written out in so many words in the Constitution. It's an interpretation of the Constitution by the Supreme Court. But two things to think about here. One, is Dred Scott wrong? So if we're just trying to understand the 1787 Constitution, I think, yeah, it's pretty clear Dred Scott is wrong in saying Congress can't ban slavery in the territories. Because Congress was doing that as a compromise, making compromises between states. That's the sort of thing Congress is supposed to do. I'm much less sure that Dred Scott is wrong in saying black people can never be US citizens. The arguments that Tawny gives, and we can talk about it more if you're interested, in support of that are actually not so bad, I think, as a matter of constitutional interpretation. So in part, I think Dred Scott is a bad reading of the 1787 Constitution. In part, I think maybe it's a good reading and a bad Constitution, because there are bad pro-slavery provisions in that 1787 Constitution. Right? I just listed them. But second and more important, saying that Dred Scott is wrong does not rescue the 1787 Constitution from responsibility for that decision, which is what this is all about, the question of whether Dred Scott is wrong. Because Dred Scott is a 7-2 decision. And you can say, oh, those 7 were biased pro-slavery judges, and maybe they were. But then you have to face the question, how did we get 7 biased pro-slavery judges on the Supreme Court? And the answer is pro-slavery presidents, who we got in part because of the 3/5 compromise. So the bottom line there is Dred Scott, I think, is clearly wrong in part. It's less wrong in another part. And it is at the least a predictable consequence of the system set up by the 1787 Constitution. So here's the question, right? Can you say that? Can you say Dred Scott is maybe right? It interpreted the Constitution correctly. Or can you say Dred Scott is at least a predictable consequence of the system we set up, or the system someone set up in 1787, and not be condemning modern America? Well, that's hard, I think, if you're trying to tell the standard story, if you're trying to tell a story of continuity, where we're the same America we always were. But it's a lot easier if you're trying to tell a different story, a story of rupture, where founding America maybe wasn't so great, and it was defeated and overthrown, and we are the heirs not of the founders of 1776 and 1787, but of the people who destroyed their America. And that's what I call the better story, which we're going to get to, I guess, later. I want to say just one more thing before I stop, if there's time, for just like a couple more minutes, which is, like, so here too I get pushback, which has helped me improve and sharpen the argument. Because people say, no, there's a lot of equality in founding America. There's a real ideal of equality, and you can look at this, and you can find constitutional provisions that support it, which is true, and it's really interesting, I think. So, why does the president have to be a natural-born citizen? Because the founders were concerned that otherwise some foreign prince might come in, and people were like, ooh, glamorous aristocracy, let's make that person our president. And they didn't like that. There's a very strong anti-aristocratic line running through the Constitution. Same thing for why the president has to be at least 35. Because who's going to be elected before they're 35, before they have a record on which you can judge them? The famous child of famous parents. Right? It's sort of anti-aristocratic. And in fact, we've got an explicit ban on titles of nobility. Right? So important, that's one of the very few things the Constitution says states can't do. No titles of nobility. So there is a real idea of equality. And you can encapsulate it in the phrase, this is America, there are no kings. So once you define your political community and you're like, we are the Americans, then they have this ideal of equality. No one is better than anyone else by birth. No one is naturally better. So we don't like superior insiders. That is the founding ideal of equality. And it also has something that we can cash out in terms of respect for individual rights. The government has to be neutral. The government can't play favorites. There's a strong strand of that too. The government can't just take something from one person and give it to another, because it likes this other person better. Now that actually turns out to stop the government from acting to promote equality. So if things have gotten very unequal, it's going to turn out the government can't redistribute in the name of equality. So it's more neutrality. But the key point, or the main point that I want to make here is, founding America has this idea that there shouldn't be superior insiders. There shouldn't be kings. It is totally fine with the idea of inferior outsiders. There can be slaves. And our modern commitment to equality has both these things, but I think that we understand it more and feel it more deeply with respect to the there are no slaves. This is America, there are no slaves, rather than this is America, there are no kings. But that is not in the Declaration at all. Neither is democracy, by the way. So that's the question that I'll leave you with to induce you to come back for the next panel, I guess. Where does this idea, this is America, there are no slaves, come from? How does that idea become part of our higher law? That's the better story.
That's great. Thank you, Kermit. Pete.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Roosevelt, for the book and for the comments. Let me say first to thank Josh and Nicole for hosting the Faith Angle Forum. And when I handed over the baton to Josh to run the Faith Angle Forum, it was one of the wiser decisions that I made. And he's done great work with it. I think has continued to open the aperture of the discussions through the Faith Angle Forum, which I think is important to do. In terms of my priority,
Before you start talking about Mike Cromley, can you say that part about Josh again?
Exactly.
Just kidding.
Exactly. What I said, just for the record, is that Josh trashed the program after I handed it over to him. Yeah, Mike was a good friend of mine, and the Faith Angle Forum really was his brainchild. He was a delightful human being, interested in things. The most ADHD person I ever knew. He used to walk into my office, and when he wanted to talk, and he would begin to pull books off my shelf and begin to take folders off my desk and look through them. Like there was nothing that he didn't want to read, or nothing that was off limits to him. But the best job that Mike ever had, apart from Faith Angle Forum, was he was a mascot for the Philadelphia 76ers.
Wow. That's true.
Which I'm sure he would have been happy with for this season. I was asked by Josh to read Professor Roosevelt's book and respond to it, which of course I was happy to do. I'll begin with a qualifier, which is I'm a reader of history, I'm an admirer of historians, but I'm not myself a historian, and I'm sure that'll become clear over the next hour or so. I agree with Professor Roosevelt that it's a bold book and that it challenges certain assumptions, which I think are worth challenging. I think this is how enlightenment happens, how learning and understanding happens, how calibration and recalibration happens. So even if you don't agree with all that Professor Roosevelt writes, and I don't, it's important to hear that perspective, even if only to encourage people to reacquaint themselves with the founding era and think these things through. I agree with him when he calls the standard story, or his argument that it lacks nuance and precision, and that the standard story can be too idealized. I think I experienced that in my own life, in my own education. When I think about social study classes that I took when I was a junior and senior, there was a lot that was missing. I think it was too idealized, and I think there were parts of American history that were given short shrift. And so I think we're in a better place now than we were then, because I think we're seeing things more truthfully now than we saw then. I also agree with him that the Gettysburg Address and Reconstruction amendments, he didn't touch on that as much in his remarks just now, but he does in the book. And he may talk about that more in the second panel, that those things did advance justice and American ideals and could be looked at in some respects as the refounding of America. The Reconstruction era in particular is not studied nearly enough, I would say, in high school, middle school. It's thought of among some as the most controversial and least understood era in American history. and its achievements were amazing. There were particularly the troika of amendments that came through at that time, 13th, 14th, and 15th, but there was much more to it than that. And finally, this is in the book, the power of narrative and stories, which is one of the topics of this session, and I'm going to return to that at the end of my remarks, because narrative and story is important. But let me now highlight several disagreements that I have with the nation that never was. The first is the claim by Professor Roosevelt that the Declaration was not about rights at all. It was about independence. And my sense is I would say that it was both. It was about independence, certainly, but it was also about rights. And I think to argue, as he does, that it was not about rights at all means you have to insist that the words mean something else than what they say, which is possible. Unalienable rights, the first two paragraphs of the Declaration. You'd have to argue that around half of the 13 colonies that moved for emancipation almost immediately after the signing of the Declaration were doing so for reasons unrelated to the Declaration, which I suppose is possible. You'd have to argue that everyone, from Pulitzer Prize-winning historians of the American founding to figures like preeminently Abraham Lincoln, but also Frederick Douglass, and Martin Luther King Jr. and Barack Obama and countless others, got it wrong, and got it wrong not on the margins, but that they got it wrong fundamentally. Again, that too is possible. I just don't think it's likely. I would just add on that second point about the movement after the Declaration that a couple of things on that. John Adams was writing a decade before the Declaration, 1766, that all men were equal, and that Jefferson himself never claimed that he invented or originated the idea of equality in 1776. And if you go back and read the history of Massachusetts, which is driven by Adams, and Pennsylvania with Franklin, they drafted and passed a constitution to free slaves within years of the passage of the Declaration. There are some, like Professor Roosevelt and Pauline Maier, who was a distinguished historian and a person whose work Professor Roosevelt relies on and credits, who took on what they perceive as the mythology that had come to surround the Declaration. In her book, American Scripture, she suggests that the people in 1776 saw the Declaration as simply an announcement that America was now independent and a rationalization as to why. She called Jefferson the most overrated person in American history. And whether that's a fair assessment or not, and it's certainly a minority assessment, she makes a pretty persuasive case that Jefferson was less the author than the draftsman of the Declaration. It's been said that the Second Continental Congress that emerges in Maier's account acted as a kind of superb editorial committee, taking away irrelevancies and weak points and producing a stronger and more persuasive document in the Declaration. To be clear, I'm not a Jefferson worshiper, in part for the reasons that Professor Roosevelt said. I'm somewhat more drawn to James Madison than I am to the Sage of Monticello. But for his part, here's what Abraham Lincoln, who not incidentally was not an incidental and or easily dismissed person in the American story, said about Jefferson. This is in his letter to Henry Pearson, 1859. All honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a mere revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men in all times, and so to embalm it there, that today and in all coming days it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. And that leads to my second point, Professor Roosevelt's claim that it's been very harmful that we locate our fundamental values in the founding, and that's a theme that appears again and again in his book. But it's worth noting that many of the greatest figures in American history and those who belong in the pantheon of justice argue precisely the opposite. That argument that America's fundamental values are located in the founding has been made time and time and time and time again. It's one of the through lines through American history. That doesn't mean it's true or it's accurate. It could be that it's a false notion and it's been repeated ad nauseum. On the other hand, these are people from different eras who are impressive in their own right. And when you have basically all of them lining up making that argument, I think it's at least an indication that it is not on its face an absurd argument or an easily disproved argument to make. In any case, slavery didn't begin with America. It was as old as human history. It's existed thousands of years without substantial criticism. And what originated in America was what Princeton historian Sean Wilentz, no conservative, called organized anti-slavery politics. And it did so because of those Enlightenment precepts in the Declaration in the first two paragraphs. Gordon Wood, whom Professor Roosevelt alluded to and is perhaps the most eminent historian of the founding, has said that Jefferson's proposition in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal is the most powerful proposition in American history, bar none. Once unleashed by the Revolution, the idea of equality tore through American society and culture with awesome force. And then he added, the Revolution unleashed anti-slavery sentiments that led to the first abolition movements in the history of the world. There's a reason why, as Wood has pointed out, that Southerners like John C. Calhoun spent so much time in the decades of the 1830s and 40s trying to prove that the Declaration's proposition that all men are created equal was the most false and dangerous of all political errors, even though it was a proposition repeated daily as an established and incontrovertible truth. I do agree with Professor Roosevelt that the Declaration has had an immediate purpose, and was directed to a revolutionary effort that was not about universal human equality. And yet in that document, Jefferson did choose to insert, and the Congress chose to insert, a statement of universal human equality, a statement that has served, as Lincoln said, as a stumbling block to tyrants ever since, and which was utterly vital to the case of abolition and civil rights. At least I would argue so, and I think some of the people that I named earlier would. So to deny this and to pretend it has no meaning or was not understood by the people who wrote it or read it originally is, I think, a mistake. And recall, too, how Lincoln described what the founders were thinking. They meant to set a tone for the future, and these are Lincoln's words, to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set it up as a standard maxim for free society, which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and values of life to all people of all colors everywhere. Of course, Lincoln emphasized this facet of the story and made the tradition clearer and sharper, but that too is part of our inheritance, and it's not possible to understand the Declaration now except through Lincoln. That's how history works, and it's how America's self-understanding has taken shape. I don't think it's right to suggest that because Lincoln took up those words and turned them into the American creed, that they had no meaning before or should have no meaning now. But perhaps I'm mistaken about that, and perhaps Lincoln was too, and so were many others. Professor Roosevelt also writes, Reconstruction was not a fulfillment of the ideals of the founding, but rather a repudiation. We modern Americans are not the heirs of the founders, but of the people who overthrew and destroyed that political order. Another way to think about this, a different way to think about this, is that the worst aspects of the political order of the founders were destroyed, and they were destroyed in part, not in whole, but in part, by invoking the ideals of the founders as set forth in the Declaration. I believe, as Lincoln believed, and as Martin Luther King believed, and as John F. Kennedy believed, and as Barack Obama believed, that we are heirs of the founders. That doesn't mean that they were perfect. They clearly were not. It doesn't mean that what they created couldn't be improved upon. It clearly could and was. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't be shaped by events different than the founding. We have been, and it's good that we have been. But I would suggest something quite important started with founders, and that the enormous progress we've seen take place in our country in my lifetime is not based on those who repudiated the ideals of the founding, but by those who celebrated them and sought to improve upon them. According to Professor Roosevelt, America today is not the founders' America, but it can be Lincoln's America. Yet Lincoln himself argued that his America couldn't be understood without appealing to the ideals of the founders. It was Lincoln who said that he never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. I also think it's hard to argue the Declaration had no role in the abolition of slavery, if only because the central figure in defeating slavery, the central figure in prosecuting the war against the Confederacy, was by his own testimony so powerfully influenced by the Declaration. Again, Professor Roosevelt may well be right, but for him to be right, some of the greatest historians of the founding and many of the greatest figures in American history have to be wrong. So I'd encourage you to read Professor Roosevelt's book. I'm glad I did. And those who challenge his thesis as well, to determine for yourself as best you can whose version of events is the closest approximation to truth and reality of things, and to do so without any predetermined ideological commitment to the outcome. Just a word on that. It's very easy for all of us, myself included, when we try and understand things. I think probably particularly with history, but not only history, that we approach those investigations like a lawyer who has a client. And so you go in with a predetermined outcome, and your effort is to try and search for facts and arguments that validate what you already believe. We all do that to some extent or another, but the degree to which we can recognize that and to try and guard against it, and to let new evidence and new facts shape our understanding of things, whether it's matters of history, politics, faith, or anything else, is, I think, all to the good. And I want to associate myself with Professor Roosevelt in this respect. I think we can tell a better story about America, a more appealing and inspiring story about America. And we can do that by invoking the Civil War, the Gettysburg Address, and especially Reconstruction, where he and I differ, I think, based not on my knowledge as a historian, but based on my own reading of history and what I've gleaned from historians, is that this better story doesn't require the repudiation, and certainly not the jackhammer decimation of the earlier story, the founding story. Professor Roosevelt argues for a radical break, a complete rupture with the original founding, and therefore on discontinuity, whereas I think Reconstruction is in some sense, the actualization of the ideals set in motion in the Declaration. Falling short of the pursuit of the ideals of the founding isn't an indictment of those ideals. The historian Mark Knoll has said that historians must resist the temptation to divide the American past into two discrete halves separated at 1865 and 1877, but rather insist on considering the nation's story as a continuous series of adjustments, with every new era deeply affected by earlier currents that expanded, contracted, or remained much as before. And that sounds about right to me. Speaking of Mark Knoll, who's an estimable historian, he was at Wheaton College, then Notre Dame, is now emeritus, and one of the leading historians on the role of faith in American history. Actually wrote a really fascinating book. I don't know if you've read it, Professor Roosevelt's The Civil War's Theological Crisis, which I'm happy to get into on why it was so fascinating to me. But the short version on that is that the story that Christians like to tell themselves, which is that Christianity was on the side of abolition and was this piston in the engine of abolition and justice, is only partly true. There were deep divisions if you read the history of the South, and many of the most prominent advocates for slavery were clergymen in the South who invoked verses in Scripture to make their argument. And of course, Christianity had very little to say about slavery for its first 1,700 years, 1,800 years itself. So in any event, that's a little bit of a rabbit hole to go down, but that book is worthwhile. And I think I would say somewhat in the spirit of what Professor Roosevelt is trying to do, which is let's take a look at what was really happening at the time and let's tell the story truthfully. But in any event, Mark, I wanted to say a word about the intersection of faith, which is relevant to the faith angle forum, and Reconstruction, which figures prominently in the work of Professor Roosevelt. And so this idea of religion and Reconstruction, and Noel has written about it. It's been said that by 1860, religion and politics had fused more completely than ever before in the American Republic. And Noel has written that between the firing of Fort Sumter in April of 1861 and the inauguration of President Rutherford B. Hayes in March 1877, almost everything respecting religion in American public life changed. The last 2 decades of scholarship affirm what James McPherson said in 1998. Religion was central to the meaning of the Civil War as the generation that experienced the war tried to understand it. Religion should be central to our efforts to recover that meaning. So Reconstruction transformed religions, and religions shaped Reconstruction. Black churches were at the center of remaking the United States post-Civil War political system into one that incorporated formerly enslaved black men into the body politic and revised the legal code to provide civil rights to these new citizens, according to Yale's Nicole Turner. That is, I think, a significant historical fact and one that deserves a good deal more attention. Last thing I want to say is something about the power and the importance of narrative, since, again, that is one of the topics for this gathering. Psychologists will tell you that often our lives are fractured and disintegrated. We have a fragmented identity. The path to healing and wholeness is to reclaim all parts of our story and to do that truthfully. When we integrate all parts of our story into a narrative, it can help us to make better sense of it all. I just want to say, personally, I'm a person of the Christian faith. And I know during the times of greatest grief and sorrow or pain that I've experienced in my life, that has been important to me, which is, as a person of faith, to try and locate what I'm going through within a larger narrative and a larger story. And of course, people who don't share my faith would say that that narrative, that story isn't true. They may be right about it. But I think it does speak to something within us of the need to put coherence into disparate events and to tell ourselves certain stories. So what's true of individuals is true of nations, and I do think this is a keen insight from Professor Roosevelt. Narratives, storytelling have shaped human culture throughout our history. Think about religious parables, think about myths, think about childhood fairy tales, think about the power of the words once upon a time. The earliest humans huddled around to listen to shamans and elders telling imaginative stories by which they made sense of their world and their lives in it. In modern times, virtually every American president has attempted, in his words and in his speeches, to place America into a meta-narrative, which is almost always tied in some way or another to the Declaration. And as a presidential speechwriter, that's something about which I know. These stories reflect our beliefs and ideals. They remind us of what we aspire to be. They create social norms and moral rules. Psychological research also tells us that narratives enhance our capacity for empathy and imagination, fostering a deeper understanding of the human experience. Storytelling can give voice to the dispossessed and the powerless, promote mutual understanding. It can bridge different worlds and give voice to truth. On the flip side, storytelling in the wrong hands can blow apart bridges of understanding, and it can give voice to lies. So it's a double-edged sword. Professor Roosevelt has to place himself in our current era within a story. It's what his book is about. So do I. So do each of you. And as journalists, you have an opportunity that a lot of others do not, which is not just to report on events, but to replace those events in a larger context, a broader narrative, to help us better see the truth, knowing that the truth will set us free. So good luck with your work, and we'll open it to conversation. And by all means, if you want to go into areas beyond the book, which some of you have read, but some of you may not have, we can do that. So at least as far as I'm concerned, anything is on the table, from career to life in America today. So thanks a lot, and thanks for being here and being part of the Faith Angle Forum.
Thank you both. We should. That's great. Well, I wasn't sure how that was going to go, and that was great. All right, so you've got a table card, place card before you. If you've got a question, maybe flip that up. We'll get a queue going, and let's dive in. And I'm going to suggest, because we have until 10:45, that we go straight. We're not going to take a break. We'll take a break then for coffee and the like. But if you've got a question, up you go. Let's start with Philip Wegman from Real Clear Politics.
Thanks, Professor. I don't know if I'm using this microphone correctly. Yeah, thank you for your presentation, Professor. Just to steelman this a bit, I'm wondering if you might respond to maybe 3 authorities on this question of the nature of the American founding. You know, when Frederick Douglass calls the Declaration and the U.S. Constitution glorious liberty documents, is he making that up out of whole cloth? Or, for instance, when Abraham Lincoln says that the U.S. Constitution is a golden apple within the silver frame of the Declaration, is that eisegesis? Is he reading something that wasn't there initially? Or, you know, Alexander Hamilton Stevens, the Vice President of the Confederacy, who argues that, you know, the Confederate Constitution is supplying something new, that there's the cornerstone of the Confederacy is the stone that was rejected by the founders, which is slavery, and it's applying something new. I mean, is he also incorrectly looking at the founding documents? You know, are these 3 individuals and others like them, for their own purposes, just making something up completely? You know, how do you explain sort of, I guess, at the start of the second founding, that you might call it, their view of the initial, 1776 moment?
Yeah, that's
Thank
a
you.
great question. Super interesting. I mean, I want to talk about more people. I'll try to focus on the ones that you mentioned. But so starting with Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass is very interesting because he changes his views on the Constitution. Frederick Douglass starts out saying that the Constitution is pro-slavery. And then he changes his views, and his change in views seems to have something to do with the ascendancy of the Republican Party. And what he ends up saying is the Constitution will cease to be pro-slavery when it ceases to be administered by pro-slavery men, which is true, right? You know, documents have flexibility. And if you're trying to advance a particular goal, you have 2 choices. I think you take the system as it is, and you work within it, and you view it in its best light, and you try to get the results that you want within the system. Or you can reject it and say, we're going to burn it all down, we're going to start over. And both of those tactics have prominent adherents and examples in American history. The weird thing that I say, sort of the big picture thing, is we tried to fix the system within the system. It didn't work. We had to break it. We burned it down and kind of started over, but we're pretending that we didn't. And to make the case for that, I'll have to tell you more about Reconstruction, which I'll get to. But that's sort of my big picture view. Frederick Douglass changes his mind on the Constitution. There are other abolitionists who say the Constitution is pro-slavery. William Lloyd Garrison publicly burns a copy. It's a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, he says. And like the consensus among law professors, and Sean Wilentz notably disagrees with this, but I don't quite understand why, is the 1787 Constitution is pro-slavery. Depends a lot on what your baseline is, and I would be happy to talk more about that with particular provisions. But most people do think, like, the 1787 Constitution is pretty pro-slavery. Douglass, I think, sees the opportunity to read it in an anti-slavery way. And is he going to get rid of the U.S. Constitution? No. So, you know, he's making the best case he can. And does he really believe it? I don't know. You know, I think there is a degree of motivated reasoning that goes on a lot, as you just heard. Like, when you go into something, if you want a particular outcome, you tend to see it that way. So, you know, sincerity, I don't know. I think it's worth saying that with respect to the Constitution, he did change his mind. It's against the consensus of most law professors. All the abolitionists, though, said the Declaration of Independence is anti-slavery. Why did they say that? Are they sincere? I kind of think, like, what is the alternative? You know, if you're in America in the 1820s and you want to say America is an anti-slavery nation, what can you point to? Not the Constitution, right? The Constitution is worse. It's got these clearly pro-slavery provisions. Not other federal documents. You know, when Congress is passing nationalization acts, it says free white people can become citizens. So the Declaration is kind of all you got. And it does sound good. It doesn't sound as good as it could, though. And this is sort of an important point. Because yes, you can make a natural rights argument against slavery. You can appeal to Enlightenment social contract theory, even sort of. John Locke, I think it's worth pointing out, did not say slavery is categorically wrong, right? Following Locke doesn't mean you don't believe in slavery. Locke actually said slavery can be justified. It is permissible to enslave defeated enemies in a just war. So if you're really following Locke, the question is, what is your justification for the slavery that you were practicing? Jefferson had some, right? What makes it difficult to justify slavery is not if you're talking about the state of nature, but the real world. And what means that you're talking about the real world is if you say people are born equal, not that they are created equal. And Massachusetts says that. So another very good point, Jefferson is not the only drafter. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin are there too. Adams and Benjamin Franklin, although Franklin's a little equivocal during the war, as I said, are anti-slavery. And in Massachusetts, you have a constitution that says people are born free and equal. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court relies on that to abolish slavery. In that case, there's an argument based on the Declaration of Independence too. Massachusetts Supreme Court ignores that. One way of understanding what's going on in early America, I think, is it's sort of Massachusetts versus Virginia. So in Massachusetts, they say born free, they abolish slavery. In Virginia, they talk about this explicitly when they're drafting the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which is in many ways the model for the Declaration of Independence. And some people say, we say that people are by nature free and independent. Isn't that problematic for slavery? They change the language. They say they have certain inalienable rights, of which when they enter into a state of society, they can by no compact divest themselves or their posterity. This is to make clear that what they're saying does not have an impact on slavery. So you've got different versions of natural rights theory out there. You've got the Massachusetts version, the Virginia version. Which is founding America? Well, I say, look maybe at the first presidents. Massachusetts and Virginia give us our first 5, 6 presidents, I think. But it tilts strongly in favor of Virginia because all the Virginians are 2-term presidents and the Massachusetts ones, that's the 2 Adamses, are 1-term. So it's 32 years of Virginia, 8 years of Massachusetts. If you're trying to say there's an essence of founding America, which I think is probably not accurate, it's more Virginia than Massachusetts. So I'm sorry I spent a lot of time on Douglas. But Lincoln quickly. So here I think Lincoln is just wrong. So Lincoln says, the Constitution is the frame of silver around the apple of gold, which is the Declaration. The Constitution is written to make the principles of the Declaration a reality. But this is where I was saying, no, that's not it at all. And I think that's just I think this is true if you think about what the Constitution actually does and how it works. So yes, there are people in founding America who care about natural rights. Who's going to protect your natural rights? It's the state governments. The state governments are the kind of governments described in the Declaration of Independence. The US Constitution, written in 1787, is not about the natural rights of individuals. It's about harmonizing relations between the states. It's about protecting the states so they can do their job of protecting the natural rights of individuals. But the Constitution is not trying to carry into execution the principles of the Declaration of Independence. That's just wrong. And then last, so Stevens and the Confederate Constitution. The Confederate Constitution is super interesting. It's almost identical to the US Constitution, right? They make explicit some things that they think are implicit in the US Constitution, like a ban on internal improvements, which is all about redistribution, sort of in the name of equality or lifting up the downtrodden. They don't like that, but they think that they are faithful to the US Constitution. Now, Stevens does say, we're rejecting this idea of equality. And Calhoun sort of said that too. What they're rejecting there is the abolitionists' 1820s and thereafter understanding of all men are created equal. And they don't really try, and I think this is a slightly complicated question, they don't really try to say that's not what Jefferson meant. Or at least we don't remember them as saying that. Because there are also people who say that's not what Jefferson meant. Jefferson Davis, in his farewell address to the Senate, very clearly says this. Calhoun also says it elsewhere. He says, all men are created equal. That's a hypothetical truism, right? He means that's a thought experiment about the state of nature. Then, like, they sort of buy into Lincoln's understanding, and then they try to deny it, and they say things that sound just stupid, because they're like, all men doesn't mean all men. You know, Stephen Douglas in the debates is like, all men really means all British citizens. That's crazy, right? Roger Taney and Dred Scott is like, all men obviously doesn't include the African race. That is not what the words say. So if you're trying to make sense of what the colonists were saying, right, I think the reading that makes sense of what they were saying is pretty consistent with the way they acted, is not that all men doesn't mean all men, but that created equal doesn't have the implications that we think it does now. So like overall, who's sincere, who's not, I don't really know. It's kind of complicated. But I would say Martin Luther King is another super interesting example of this. Because look, there is King in 1963 talking about the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and saying, you know, denying black people the right to vote is inconsistent with the Declaration of Independence, and surely he believes all these things. Well, interesting, right? In 1948, as a junior in high school, he enters an oratory competition with a speech called The Negro and the Constitution, which is about kind of the same question as I Have a Dream, which is what determines how black people deserve to be treated in America, and it's all about Reconstruction. He says, we conquered Southern armies by the sword, and now we must conquer Southern hate, and if you give black people the rights that they are entitled to, they will defend, even by force of arms, the arc of federal liberty against the traitors. Which is, I think, like, wow, forceful, strong. But what else is that? It's divisive. How do white Americans and Southern white Americans respond to those words? Not so well. So I kind of think, with King at least, this really is strategic. So like Douglas, I don't know, Lincoln, I don't know. With King, I think this really is strategic. By the time he gets to 1963, he's trying to broaden his appeal and bring in white Americans. The way you do that, historically, is look at the founding. We all feel good about the founding, right? We're all connected to the founding. The founding's on my side. There are, I could say a lot more about
well, I mean, we need to make sure that your
consequences
next answer has a little bit more passion,
okay, sorry.
a little bit more historical fluency.
That was massively
I want to
helpful,
see.
thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I wonder if can I ask if Pete wants to weigh in on that?
Yeah,
briefly?
I'll do it very briefly because I know you all have a lot of questions. I'd make several points, and all of what Professor Roosevelt has said is worth listening to. He's obviously knows his stuff and read it well. The first is, and it's a great question, Philip, that you ask. I do think that there's the fact that certain events were catalyzed after the Declaration, which hadn't ever happened prior to history, and they were virtually immediately after. A mentor of Professor Roosevelt's, Akil Amar at Yale, that's one issue in which he disagrees with him. And makes a very strong argument that essentially half of the 13 colonies almost immediately moved toward the abolition of slavery. And it's not just Massachusetts, it's also Pennsylvania and their constitutions. So I think that you have to argue that that's just incidental, that they actually were operating without basing it on the Declaration, or even that the Declaration is a negative sort of pro-slavery document. But to have all of history built around slavery, to have the Declaration in 1776 and like a light switch going on, this movement begins. It doesn't succeed, but there's no question that it was a catalytic event, or it was a catalytic moment. The second thing is, I think that's right. I mean, you have to go through and you have to give an explanation for Lincoln and for Douglas and for King and for Obama and everybody else, as well as Pulitzer Prize winning, Bancroft winning historians, that they all got it wrong, and that they've gotten it almost transparently wrong, whether it was because they were wrong or because they had to adjust their sights of what the reality force. I just think that that isn't persuasive to me, and I think if you read their arguments, including Lincoln, the fact that Douglas changed, I think, is to his credit, not a criticism. As far as Martin Luther King, he said that in 1848. He was still in his teens. By 1963, he had read a lot, he had learned a lot, and you read that speech, and it's not only the I Have a Dream speech. If you read King's sermons and his letter from Birmingham jail, which is somewhat different, countless speeches that he gave, he returned again and again and again to the Declaration, just as Lincoln did. And that goes to my last point, which is because one of the central arguments that Professor Roosevelt makes is not just that the people got it wrong in saying that the Declaration was a liberty document. To him, the thing that concerns him much more is that it's been harmful that that's happened. And I just don't think that that accords with history. You just take two events, which is the abolition of slavery and the Civil War. Now, on the abolition of slavery, there's no question that it was a war that ended slavery, not words. But the words informed the person who prosecuted the war. And the person who defeated slavery, the Confederacy, Lincoln, again, kept coming back again and again and again to his interpretation of the Declaration in a way that's antithetical to what Professor Roosevelt argues. And the other one is the Civil Rights Movement, which I think is generally understood and rightly understood as a great moment, difficult moment. But whether rightly or wrongly historically, that movement was based on the Declaration, and it succeeded. So I think the argument that the Declaration is a liberty document, that view is not just wrong, but malicious, that it's done enormous damage, is belied by the events that it helped inspire, which was to advance us more toward liberty. Anyway, we got a lot of other questions.
It's great. Okay, we got 5 of you on the list. Brianna Frank, Leah Danelia, Harvest Prude, Jonquilyn Hill, and Lauren Constantino. So Brianna from USA Today, you're up.
Thank you so much for this discussion. I am interested in the idea of a national story, and I'm wondering to what extent you think a new national story can sort of permeate the American public when it seems that people are so siloed, both in terms of social media, news media. You know, we've talked about in various discussions that there's not even a sense of a shared reality. You know, we're seeing that with, you know, certainly in politics and elections. But I'm wondering, again, to what extent can we have a shared national story? And also, if that's a project that is worth pursuing, what mechanisms would be effective in disseminating that when, you know, as I mentioned, you know, people are so siloed, and you know, everyone sort of has their outlets that they turn to and their own social media algorithms. So what would actually be effective at reaching you know, a large portion of the public?
Go ahead. I'll let him.
You got it, Kermit.
Okay, I'm gonna make this shorter.
That's great.
Sorry.
It's great. It's great.
So can we have a shared story in our current information ecosystem? Honestly, I don't know. That's a difficult question. I am not trying to address it here. I think it's worth thinking about. But if we wanted a different story, would we be able to move to that? How would we do it? I have thought more about that. So one answer is you go out and you talk and you persuade people. And so my experience, like when I talk to my law students, I think I get like 50% buy-in. When I talk to older audiences, I get less. I usually get like 1 or 2 people saying, hey, that sort of makes sense. When I talk to younger audiences, I think I get more, like above 50%. So part of the answer there is if people have a narrative and a story of America in their minds already, it's hard to dislodge because they interpret it as an attack. They feel defensive. It's hard to get people to be receptive to what you're saying. So my solution to that is, hey, start with younger people, start with students, which I feel a little bit bad about because now I'm confessing I'm trying to brainwash your children. But I think it's for the good. So the answer would be start with, you know, high school and elementary education, and it doesn't have to be radical. Let's just talk more about Reconstruction. We'll talk a little bit less about the founding, and we'll see where that goes. Gordon Wood, interestingly enough, says before Abraham Lincoln, when people talked about the founders, they were talking about 17th century founders, like John Bradford. So the idea of the 18th century founders as our founding fathers comes about in large part, he says, because of Lincoln, you know, in like the 1840s and 50s maybe. So we can change our national narrative, and I think we've done it several times. I think after Reconstruction, for a while, after Reconstruction was overthrown, we had a birth of a nation as our national narrative, which is like redemption, the overthrow of Reconstruction is the real birth of America. And I think we can change it again.
Very, very quickly, and I think I associate a lot of what Professor Roosevelt said. I associate myself with it. It's a really good question. The new national story is never easy to advance. I'd say it's particularly hard to advance in this moment, and I think this moment is both consistent with other moments in American history and also sui generis. And it's the sui generis part that I worry about, which is not just the polarization or the affect of polarization, but the bubbles in which people live in. And there's a ton of literature on it, and I'm sure you all have talked about it. But the capacity now through the internet and other ways for people to link to conspiracy theories and false studies that validates, and then the ability for conspiracy theorists to create a community, which really had never happened, well, not never, but it was much harder to create a community in the past. You could keep these movements on the fringe, but now, because of the advent of technology, these communities can connect and to grow. And if you ask me, like, what's my major concern for this decade, I would say the assault on truth and on reason. Is really, really worrisome. So it's really hard. People are called to act at different moments, given different challenges and different opportunities. Sometimes you're called to push back and try and prevent awful movements from gaining power or from maintaining power, and to push back against awful narratives and awful acts. And sometimes there are opportunities that are created, and then you have the chance to be able to create more positive ones. I'd say right now, the main task, not the only task, but the main task is to defeat a pernicious, malicious, malignant narrative on the American right, and that has to be stopped and has to be defeated before there's a chance to create a new story. I would say, and I was very, very critical of Donald Trump and his movement as early as anybody. Actually warned about him in 2011 in the Wall Street Journal, called the GOP and the Birther Trap. So he's been on my radar for a long time, Donald Trump. I think he's succeeded in part because he has an easy narrative and one that resonates with a lot of people. And so to defeat it, you have to have a counter narrative that is at least as powerful, but you have to beat it at the ballot boxes as well. I also think that you need leaders who can embody that new narrative, one that's hopeful and uplifting and true, and has the capacity to articulate what those ideals are. Right now, I don't think that person really exists. Joe Biden, I thought, in 2020 had the right theory of the case. I think the core of his argument was the soul of the nation. And I think he won in part because of it. But for a variety of reasons, he's not equipped to be able to make that case, like Barack Obama. And I wouldn't forget Barack Obama in terms of, he had the power. He was an enormously gifted person. And he had the power to create a narrative. That was all the excitement in 2008. It wasn't all that long ago. So I don't think we're destined to not have people who can articulate narratives. And then the last one is, the sense it's important to have people to have feeling of human agency, that they can actually change things. And the way I kind of understand it, or at least that I tell it to myself, is what we're called to be as individuals is to be faithful, not necessarily to be successful. You would prefer to be successful, but all you can do and control is to be faithful in your own life, your own domain, your own words, and your own actions. And life is a theater of vicissitudes, as Adam said. And you can make arguments at one moment, and Professor Roosevelt will know this because of his command of history, where these arguments just don't take root at a particular time. And then something changes, and often we don't know why it changes. And then the aperture widens, and there's a moment. So you have to keep making the arguments as best you can, and then you have to hope and trust that events allow in this case, a new narrative to take hold.
Let's go next to Leah Danelia from NPR Code Switch.
Hi, thank you both. My question is also about narrative. You both talked about meta-narrative and kind of the importance of having a narrative that's both positive and truthful, and one that can be inspiring. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about why it's important for that narrative to be positive rather than more neutral, and if having a positive narrative ever interferes with that pursuit of a truthful narrative.
Go ahead. You can talk maybe some about Reconstruction too, because that's such a fascinating.
Well, sure. So I think that's a great question. In part, I guess I'm sort of taking it for granted because when people say, we don't want to teach our school children that America is a bad country, I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm sort of starting from the premise that nations need a story that brings people together and inspires them and makes them believe in the nation. Now, maybe that's not true necessarily. So there are other countries that don't have national stories in the same way that we do, that don't feel a sense of continuity to the founders in the same way that we do. I think actually almost no country feels a sense of continuity with the founders in the way that we do. But maybe that's one way in which America is different, because what else do we have, right? We don't have a shared racial identity. We don't have a shared religious identity. We're not all people whose ancestors have lived here for hundreds or thousands of years. So in a sense, what brings America together is ideas and fidelity to the Constitution. And then part of that also, I think, is narrative. Now, the standard story, as I've been describing it, doesn't have to be super positive and triumphalist. So there are basically two versions out there. There's the conservative version, which is like, America, you're great. You have lived up to the promise of the Declaration of Independence. Good job. And there's the sort of progressive version, which is, America, there are still problems. You have not lived up to these ideals. You need to fix them. And in some ways, the liberal Jeremiad version is more powerful in motivating people to change. So it doesn't have to be entirely sugar-coated, I'm saying. But it does have to say something like, fundamentally, we are a good people and we need to achieve that goodness, I think, in order to motivate people to act for the nation. And so, one, I think history in general is kind of ideological and there's a perspective to it and people are trying to do certain things. But national stories even more have to be useful.
I'd say a couple of things about it. One is I do think that the American story, the narrative is probably more important for America than for other countries. I think in part because the founding was unique. I mean, it was based on a set of ideals. It was not blood and soil. And so, but the very nature of how the country was founded, I think that the need for narrative is probably stronger in this country than not. When positive narratives come up against truth, I don't know which is more important or which wins. I mean, I would say truth. I just think that you can't falsify events in order to advance a narrative, even if you think it's important. Of course, you could have caveats to any rule, but as a general matter, I think to distort truth is wrong, and I think it leads you into ultimately bad places. I don't think it necessarily needs to be that you don't have a positive narrative if you are critical of the founding of the country or aspects historically. I mean, in some respects, Professor Roosevelt's book, although, as I said, I have disagreements with it, I think it's probably a repudiation. His argument, if I simplified it, is don't look to the Constitution, the Declaration, look to the Gettysburg Address, and look to Reconstruction. And out of that, he would argue, and I think he's right, you can make a pretty compelling story and narrative. He just locates it at a different place. So I don't think you have to idealize, certainly you don't have to idealize the American founding or the American founders to get a positive story. I think what you have to do is to locate the argument for justice and human flourishing and to show people that that's within our reach and within our capacity and give them specific ways to be able to do it. to the degree that you can use history and to summon the better angels of one's nature by linking it to the best part of who we've been as a society, as a country, that helps. But you can also speak with enormous force and power of the evils of history, which can actually catalyze in people, kind of move their hearts to say, this is what happens when you commit yourself to injustice. And that motivates people to try and promote justice.
If I could take liberty to just add a quick addendum to that, I think, if you're a journalist and you're thinking about a gemstone for a piece that is positive but kind of embellished versus a gemstone or a cornerstone to your piece, a framing to your piece that is realistic and compelling, you're going to choose B. You're not nobody. But I do think one of the points of departure for this program is that the country is a very religious place still, and whether that's true of us as journalists or not, the country is a very religious place still. I mean, even if it was, we like to say this all the time. 71% of people in the country were engaged in a religious community for something like 7 straight decades. In the last 25 years or so, that's diminished substantially to more like 49%, 48.5%, says Gallup. So religion is going down, but it's still a very religious country. And for those people, religion is oftentimes a deeper narrative that frames their life than politics or than what's going on in the next presidential race between a 77-year-old and an 81-year-old. So I think that's really important for us to kind of get our arms around. That's a big part of what motivates these kinds of gatherings, which will continue and continue and continue. Let's go to Harvest Prude from Christianity Today.
Thank you so much. You've both addressed this a little bit, but I'm curious if you could address the culture war clashes that we're seeing in state laws and schools around the country over our national story. And if you could compare or locate America in the wider international context, what can we learn from countries that have had to grapple with sort of the dark underbellies of their history? I'm thinking of Germany versus maybe how totalitarian countries don't acknowledge human rights abuses, etc.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I feel from your question like you understand this. But what I would say is, yeah, we're seeing a culture war on which one side does not want to discuss bad things that happened in America's past, because they think it's going to make certain people feel uncomfortable and maybe it's going to make people question the goodness of America. And the response is to try to suppress those facts, which I've said, one, I don't believe in because I believe in accuracy. So I don't believe in it sort of as a matter of principle. And two, I don't believe it will work. Because what happens is you can suppress the information that these people get in school when they're 12 to 18. You can't suppress what they learn online at the same time, and they will just end up feeling that they've been lied to, and they will reject you harder than they might have otherwise. And yeah, I think Germany contrasted with China or Russia, or the Soviet Union is a good example, because it's much healthier and more productive to confront the bad things that happened in the past and ask, what can we learn from this? How can we avoid doing this again? Than airbrush the history, and take people out of photos. I should say, just the last thing, I'm not going to talk about it a lot, this kind of connects to the debate about Confederate statues. And what does it mean to take down a Confederate statue? Does it mean that you're whitewashing history and eliminating uncomfortable truths about the past? No, I think it doesn't. It means you're not celebrating those people. We do not learn history from Confederate statues. We're supposed to learn it in schools.
Yeah, I'd say two things about it. On the culture war, I agree. In terms of the criticisms of the right and the movements toward censorship, and I think that there's certainly a tropism to try and sell a falsified version of American history. That's a problem. I'd caution the left on doing the same thing. I think in the same way that people on the right can give an idealized version, I think people on the left are susceptible to giving a false version that it's a complete catastrophe and that it's all dark. essentially hopeless. The 1619 Project is interesting. I think there are important elements of it. I also think that they got some things wrong. I think that eminent historians pointed out that they got some things just factually wrong, at least interpretively wrong, that they would argue. And I worry that this sort of ping pong effect is bad for the country, because each action catalyzes a response, and it's often oversteering. Again, I guess this comes back to just trying as best we can to acknowledge the truth and to build around it. In terms of models from other countries, that's a really good point, and I've thought about it. This is, obviously each of these situations are particular to facts and circumstances, but South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think, is a pretty good model in how they went about that when Mandela won and after the horrifying effects of apartheid. So that, I'd say, is a pretty good model. There were some efforts after the Rwandan massacre. I had friends who were part of those efforts. So you can look there. Germany has its own example, which I think was a largely successful one. They named it. We have a friend who's a psychologist who talks about the importance within individual relationships and family relationships of naming it. We have this tendency to try and avoid conflict, to dance around it, or to pretend that certain things aren't happening. So I think you need to be able to name certain things and then try as best you can to recover. And Germany, after the horrors of the Holocaust, and for decades after, I think, dealt with that reasonably well, and is a better country because of it. There's now actually, ominously, a reaction in much of the Western world of far-right parties that are the rise of neo-Nazi movements and so forth, and in France with Le Pen and so forth. So there is a counter-reaction to those. But I'm a big fan of using historical examples to think through some models and then trying to adjust them to the particulars of your own country and the facts and circumstances of your own country.
Jonquilyn Hill, Fox, with the Weeds podcast.
Hello. Thank you all so much for doing this. This is great. My question is also about narrative. So whenever these discussions about the founding fathers come up, like the kind of question that's in the back of my mind is, okay, why do we care? They're not here anymore. But we are. I think of it sort of like a family of origin. Like you're raised by your family, but then eventually you grow up and you get to create your life and the world and the family you live in. And I think that's kind of where we are. And it seems like the answer to that is narrative. And I just wonder, why do we need a narrative so badly? Can our democracy exist without it? Like, why do we have to have these stories, these figures? Why can't we just decide, all right, that was the past and we're gonna do what we do now?
You want me to go?
Yeah.
Why don't you go and then I'll...
Oh, well, so I mean, I don't have that much to say on that, honestly. I think maybe we could do without a national story. I mean, I definitely think we could do without so much of an emphasis on the national story and continuity. I feel like constitutional originalism is part and parcel of that. This idea that it's really important to recapture the original understanding of the founders because that holds the key to solutions to problems in the present day. That's all just, well, I don't want to be too extreme, but a lot of that strikes me as pretty much made up. Because if you look back at what the founding generation actually thought about the Constitution when it was written and ratified, it turns out they didn't think that there was this founding moment when meanings are fixed and that in the future our task is to live up to that and carry forward these fixed meanings. They thought, hey, here's a document with a lot of flexibility stating general principles. It'll be really interesting to see how that gets worked out in practice. And I guess people are going to argue over what this means in the future. And they just didn't expect that we were going to feel this deep sense of attachment and need of fidelity to the past. So I mean, I think you're right there. And I sort of think that like the analogy to your family of origin is a good one, because as a child, like you really look up to your parents and you want to be like them. And then as you grow older, you get a more realistic understanding and you define yourself in part in opposition to them and not just in imitation. And I do think that's a more mature perspective on the past, and we would be better off if we could achieve that.
Yeah, that's a really intriguing question. The first thing I'd say is the importance of narrative for a nation, and in the case of the United States, it doesn't necessarily have to be the founding of the country. Again, Professor Roosevelt thinks that overall that's been a net negative, has a certain view of it, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't have a narrative. He locates it separately. So I don't think to argue that we need a meta-narrative for a country doesn't tell you necessarily where you begin that meta-narrative or the events that you mention. Now, having said that, it's the broader question, which to me is a really fascinating one. Just what's the importance of narratives in our lives, the lives of an individual, the lives of a country? The family of origin reference is a fascinating one because I think we're all products of our families of origin more than we recognize when we're younger, because there are certain habits that we develop, certain ways of interaction, certain stories that we imbibe, things that we assume are just givens in life when they're not necessarily givens. They're things that we developed, that we were told growing up, lessons that we learned. And then when you get older, when you get married, you have relationships, you begin to see, oh gosh, my story is different than my wife's story or somebody else's story. And I think it's important to be able to again use that phrase, name that and work through it. But it underscores the power that has in us in ways that I think we're not fully aware of. I don't think, in terms of a nation, I don't think that having a meta-narrative is important necessarily in the daily lives of individuals. I don't think on Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock people are contemplating the importance of the Declaration or Reconstruction and thinking, gosh, how do I get through the next 3 hours, without thinking about it. So it's not a present reality. I do think that it's interesting that at key moments in the life of a nation, presidents and leaders understand the importance of narrative because they almost always go back to it. And that's the importance of locating yourself within a story. And I just think it's the nature of human beings, which is what I was alluding to at the end of my remarks, which is the need to place ourselves within a story, to have examples, to aspire to have the human heart moved in ways, to love what's honorable, to love justice, to care about those things. And that, in my experience in life, is not primarily done through logical arguments, through mathematical equations. It's somehow locating ourselves in stories and in other things. And then the last thing I'll say is, you probably realize this too. I think it was Dave Brooks, who's a good friend of mine, he said that he was told once by somebody, maybe it was a psychologist, that you can't tell too many stories and good stories in a speech. He said, people don't, and I know this from sermons, having gone to a lot of them over the course of my life, you often come away and you don't remember the core argument or the propositions that were made. You remember stories and so forth. So I just think that there's something about human nature that we've known, as I said, going back from the beginning of humankind, once upon a time, and all of the rest. So I think wise leaders and wise nations appreciate that and try and construct their national life around it, again, in a way that's truthful and without overdoing it.
Super quick, prompted by Pete on the nudge for stories. Okay, we got both of you guys, Lauren and Haley. Let's get these both asked. But real quick on Bono, the U2 singer, who had that wonderful book on religion last year. he used to say, being an American is like seeing a house up on a hill, and it's a beautiful house. It's a mansion. And you think to yourself, someday I could be that guy. And being an Irishman is like seeing a beautiful house up on a hill. It's a mansion. And you look at that thing and you say, I'm going to get that bastard. All right, we're up with Lauren Constantino and Haley Fuchs. Let's ask both of them if we can, and then we'll close it out.
Okay, I'll be quick. I put my thing down because you guys kind of already talked about education and culture wars. But in Florida, we have a governor who is obsessed with fighting indoctrination in schools. And, we just passed a law about teaching the dangers of communism in K through 12 schools. And, I'm wondering, okay, we have this dichotomy of America is good versus America is bad. And I feel like the truth, or at least what you all are talking about, exists somewhere in the gray area and the nuance. And, there's a lot of analysis and examination that has to happen. But, with school standards, you have to have, this is what we're teaching, right? It has to be very black and white. And there's been, big arguments and debates around that in Florida. So much so that, some groups have taken it upon themselves to teach history. Like I did a story about this group called Faith in Florida that decided if you're not going to teach Black history in schools, if you're going to take that away, we're going to create a curriculum to teach in the churches. And, that's just an interesting side note there. But to me, I just want to raise the point, does it benefit a government to have an enlightened, educated people, right? Because I feel like the goal of some lawmakers is just to have, to teach a narrative that inspires patriotism or that inspires loyalty to the country, right? So how do we frame this conversation in a way that, puts the nuance back into the conversation and doesn't support this sort of dichotomy of America is good and America is bad, particularly in schools, because that's kind of where I think a lot of this boils down to. So.
Thanks for being here with us today. Dr. Roosevelt, you mentioned that the Declaration of Independence is not consistent or is not inconsistent with slavery, that it doesn't kind of include the ideals that we now ascribe to it. I'm curious whether you think that if there was a Declaration of Independence that could have been written at the time that would be consistent with the ideals that we now find in it.
Thank you so much for asking that. Let me just take that quickly. Yes, so if you wanted to write a document that condemned slavery and talked about freedom and equal rights in society, you would say not people are created, but people are born. People are born equal. And you would say they remain, to make it clear that you're talking about society. They are born and remain equal in rights. And then you would say something about discrimination. You would say discrimination among people can be made only for the general good, or something like that. What is that? That is the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which Jefferson helped draft. So when he wanted to write that kind of a declaration, he knew how to do it. Then very quickly on the first question, I think that there's an inescapable ideological element to education. First, because we don't just teach facts, we pick the facts that we teach, right? You could teach people the Providence phone book, and it would be factual, but no one would do that for our history. So you're trying to do something. And in a public school, I think it's fair to say we're trying to make good citizens. So then the question is how do you do that? And I think the answer is you don't need to say America is good or America is bad. You need to say there are good things and bad things in our history, and here's what we can learn from that.
Yeah, two things, just very quickly, what Professor Roosevelt mentioned, the words in the French, that the French use. I will say that the French Revolution ended rather poorly compared to the American Revolution. And ours is probably esteemed, I think rightly so, as opposed to what befell us after the French Revolution. That's probably historically worth keeping in mind. Yeah, in terms of the culture war, what's happening in Florida, I mean, I agree completely. I mean, it's not, I think you said it actually, it's not good and bad. It's a mixed picture as it is for every country. And so I think you need to teach the truth. Of course, then you get into the question of, well, what's the truth? And I think there's what you teach, which matters a lot, and then there's who teaches it as well, right? So you can have a really good curriculum, and if you have teachers that can mess it up, a lot, and then you can have people who are dealing with more limited curriculum and can be great teachers because they have the capacity to try and they're great educators in heart. I mean, I think for sure a country would benefit from being enlightened and being truthful, and I do think, just speaking here as someone who had been a lifelong Republican until 2016, that that there is a movement on the American right. I don't even refer to it as conservative because I think in important ways it's anti-conservative, but that's a different conversation for a different time. But I think it's a benighted movement. I think it's anti-intellectual, and I think that it's driven by deep passions and emotions and anger, which are doing, I think, great harm to the country and to truth. But the challenge, and you may have experienced this in your life, I certainly have in mine, partly because of my station in life, but I know a lot of people who have been, lifelong Republicans. And I have a lot of conversations with Trump supporters, which creates its own complications because of my own position. But what I found is that in my interaction with them, it's really important to listen well. I mean, I have my point of view, but I try to understand from people, ask them kind of, how did you come to believe what you believe? Who do you listen to? Who are the people or things that have shaped your view? I do it for several reasons. One is it helps me, right? In the same way Professor Roosevelt said he was glad for some of the criticisms he's gotten from the book because it causes him to think, did I get it right? Or maybe I have to refine something. Or maybe I got it right, but I have to dig a little deeper to prove why I got it right. So there's that element. What is it that maybe that I'm missing out of my view, from my point of view, that I need to hear? But the other one is that in my experience, if people feel like they're genuinely cared for and they're seen as more than their political being, that lets the guards down and the conversations are much more constructive. And I've had people, I'm not sure confess is exactly the right word, but to open up to me about certain doubts that they may have, that I know darn well that if I had, emailed a 10-page point-by-point rebuttal, would not have worked because it would have gotten their back up, they would have gotten defensive, and they would have felt like their core identity is under attack. So to me, trying to understand that question of core identities, what are people's core identities, how did it shape it, and how do you change it if it is, in fact, objectively problematic, is really, I think, one of the great tasks. And I don't know how to do it writ large. I have a little bit better sense of how to do it writ small, just in individual lives and individual conversations.
Kermit Roosevelt, Pete Wayner are giving us a lot. Thank you, guys.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much. Glad to be back. So I'm going to try to tell you now a little bit about why I think my better story is better, and also about how it works with Reconstruction, trying to emphasize that I think Reconstruction is a real break in American history. 1868 is as sharp a break as 1776. So first, what's the better story? Well, the better story says American ideals are the product of dissent, which the standard story does too. Like, we Americans, we're the scrappy rebels. We always like that. But it's not dissent from England and the monarchy. It's more dissent from founding America and slavery. People look around founding America, they realize there's injustice in that world, and they set out to change it. And these people are basically abolitionists. So I'm telling you, abolitionists are our founding fathers. And it is pretty well historically documented, like the people who really make a big deal out of all men are created equal, pick up this new reading, that is the abolitionists. And they start saying this is not about equality in the state of nature, which in the book I call Jefferson's equality. It's about equality in society, which I call Lincoln's equality. So abolitionists put this new reading on the Declaration. It gains popularity. And then most significantly, in 1860, the anti-slavery Republican Party, first anti-slavery party we have, their first candidate, John Fremont, is the first anti-slavery presidential candidate we have. They win the presidency in 1860, and the South secedes. And this gives us a war. A war is a crisis. Crisis is a great opportunity for change. But Lincoln, if you believe him, at least initially, doesn't really want change. He wants to restore the status quo. And all of his speeches are about union. But then, around 1863, something changes. The word nation replaces the word union in his speeches. He says slavery is going to end. This is the message of the Emancipation Proclamation, although the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't itself do that. And he says there will be a new birth of freedom, right? That's the Gettysburg Address. So what's happening here? How do we understand the Civil War? The best way to think about it, I've come to believe, is to distinguish between two different types of revolutions. One is what I call a regime change revolution, where the idea is the existing regime is unjust and must be destroyed. And that would be the French Revolution, overthrowing the monarchy, or the Russian Revolution, overthrowing the Tsar. And the second type is a status quo revolution, where the idea is the existing regime is fine, it's legitimate, but we are being denied the rights that we are due under it. And that would be the first American Revolution, where the colonists' basic complaint is we are being denied our rights as Englishmen. And it's also the second American Revolution, because the Confederates, as I said, do not repudiate the US Constitution. What they say is the free states and the national government are distorting the Constitution. They are denying us the rights that we were guaranteed when we joined this union. But what happens in 1863 is the Civil War changes. It shifts from a status quo revolution to a regime change revolution. Not on the part of the Confederacy, because they are still fighting for what they always were, but on Lincoln's side, right? The existing regime is unjust and must be destroyed. That's the message of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address. And we look back now, and this is the 80% I said, everyone agrees with this. We see some kind of turning point in 1863, where suddenly, maybe not suddenly, but now visibly, the goal is no longer restoration of the Union, it's the end of slavery. And of course, everyone says, Lincoln wants to destroy the Confederate regime because it's unjust. But here's my radical 20%, that's not the regime he's destroying. So remember, the 1787 Constitution singles out slavery for special protection in various ways. It says, or it implies, if you believe those 7 justices in Dred Scott, Congress can't ban slavery. Black people can never become US citizens. So if you ban slavery, as the 13th Amendment does, if you grant birthright citizenship, as the 14th Amendment does, you are destroying that political regime. You are destroying founding America. Now, the standard story says, wait a second, not so fast. We're doing this through the amendment process that's set out in Article 5, and what we're really doing is putting the values of the Declaration of Independence into the Constitution. And I completely admit that's what people said at the time. Republican members of Congress did say that. They did also say this is a revolution. Right? So one point to make in response is maybe you did it through Article 5, but if you change the founding principles so radical, that's still a revolution. This is why the 13th Amendment didn't make it through the House the first time. They were like, you can't do this by amendment. It's such a radical change. It's a revolution. But the stronger point, I think, which I'll get to, is they didn't actually really do it through Article 5 either. So the Civil War, I'm trying to tell you, is not the triumph of the Declaration of Independence and the redemption of founding America. It's the repudiation of the Declaration of Independence and the defeat of founding America. So why would we think that? Well, think about the Civil War and Reconstruction and ask which side founding America is really on there. Start maybe with the Declaration of Independence. I feel it's pretty clear the Declaration of Independence supports the Confederacy. Because what are they doing? They are declaring their independence. And why are they doing it? They think the system of government they have is not working, and a different one would better affect their safety and happiness. It's precise words of the Declaration of Independence. And they are not wrong about that. I mean, they're wrong because they're evil, immoral people fighting to defend slavery, but they joined a union with a governing charter that protected slavery in a bunch of different ways. And now the national government has fallen into the hands of people who want to destroy it, because the Republican Party is an abolitionist party. And Lincoln at the beginning is talking about observing all of the limits on his constitutional power, but the Republicans want to destroy the institution on which Southern society is based. So the Declaration says governments get their just authority from the consent of the governed. Confederates say, we are withdrawing it. We're starting over. And Lincoln, who says he's fighting in the name of the Declaration of Independence, is saying, no, I reject your independence. I'm going to use military force to make you stay in the Union, and then I'm going to remake your society against your will. That actually seems pretty clear to me. And if you want a modern echo, it would be Joe Biden giving his democracy in peril speech, saying, you can't be pro-America and pro-insurrection. Saying that in front of Independence Hall, where we pledged our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor to the insurrection that we say starts the American story. Like, something strange there. And I think you can make the same argument about the 1787 Constitution. It's a little bit less clear, but the general point is the founders thought the national government was the dangerous one, and that if it started behaving tyrannically, the states would stand up and defend the rights of their citizens. So the Revolutionary War, where the militias fight off the redcoats, the state military forces defeat the national army, that is the model built into the 1787 Constitution. Most obviously, that's what the Second Amendment is about. And you can read Federalist 46 to confirm this. James Madison is trying to reassure readers that the states will always be more important than the national government, and, says explicitly, will defeat it in war if necessary. So what would happen, he asks, if the federal government starts interfering with the way states want to run their societies? And if you're a slave owner from Virginia writing this, as James Madison is, you're thinking about slavery. If necessary, he says, it would come to force. It would be a replay of the revolution, right? 13 states against the national government, Betsy Ross flag, 13 stars in a circle, and he says, of course, the states will win. So in 1776, every state recognizes slavery. Every star in that Betsy Ross flag represents a slave state. And this is exactly what happens, right? 13 states, if you accept the Confederate claims to Missouri and Kentucky. And the reason they said Missouri and Kentucky have joined us is they wanted 13. 13 states fight the national government. They raise that flag, 13 stars in a circle, each star representing a slave state. That's the first flag of the Confederacy. But they lose. And what I'm saying is, founding America loses there too, right? The Declaration of Independence loses because we reject independence. We reject consent of the governed. The 1787 Constitution loses not just in terms of slavery, but because the Reconstruction amendments totally changed the nature of the relationship between the states, the people, and the national government, right? The Founders' Constitution, I said, leaves all of these individual-to-individual interactions up to the states. With Reconstruction, the national government is coming in and protecting individuals against the states, which it really didn't do before. The first constitutional provision, so during Reconstruction, they also try to protect individuals from other individuals. The Supreme Court kind of stops them. But the first constitutional provision that places a limit on what one individual can do to another individual is the 13th Amendment banning slavery. And then the 14th Amendment rejects the laws of slavery as if they were no more valid than a rebel debt. And what I'm talking about there is uncompensated emancipation, which probably doesn't seem radical because it's so obviously the right thing to do, but it's very radical at the time. So if you want to abolish slavery while maintaining your political order, the way the North did before the Civil War, you do it gradually and you pay compensation. That's what they all did. Even in 1862, when Congress banned slavery in the District of Columbia, they pay compensation because they understand they're taking away something that is protected by a valid law. But now there is no compensation. And what does that suggest? It suggests the laws of slavery were never valid. They're part of a political order that is being rejected and overthrown, right? This is not what you do when you reform a slaveholding society. It's what you do when you destroy it. So the 14th Amendment says there will be no payment of rebel debt. All those claims are illegal and void. And then same sentence, same language, there will be no payment of claims based on emancipation. All those claims are illegal and void. And again, you might think, well, sure, right, of course. Of course we're rejecting claims based on Confederate laws of slavery. But the key point, those aren't Confederate laws. So one, they existed in the Confederacy before secession. They existed in every state before, at 1776. And also, they existed in states that stayed in the Union: Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky. And then they're all wiped away because the existing regime is unjust and must be overthrown, And the existing regime there is not the Confederacy, but founding America. So that's about sort of the substance. And then the process, I think we also do not understand the process of Reconstruction as well as we should. How did these Reconstruction amendments get ratified? Well, the Confederate States accept that slavery is over in name, and they ratify the 13th Amendment. But they are not willing to accept black citizenship, which is the first sentence of the 14th Amendment, birthright citizenship. And they actually reject the 14th Amendment. And again, it's not just the former Confederates. Delaware and Maryland reject the 14th Amendment. Ohio and New Jersey try to withdraw their ratifications. If you look at what happens in 1866, Congress asks founding America to accept black people as citizens, and founding America says no. By 1867, it's clear the 14th Amendment is not going to be ratified. You can't get 3/4 of the states. So what happens? This is Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Act, Congress wipes out 10 of the former Confederate states. Not Tennessee, because it ratified. But Congress says no governments exist in these states. The military is in control. And then it says, we're going to make new states. So they got the same names, they have the same geography, but they have a different political community because Congress says formerly enslaved people are citizens. And they have a different distribution of political power because the states are supposed to hold constitutional conventions and write constitutions, and the formerly enslaved can participate, and the former Confederates can't. So what's going on here? Well, historians tend to say Congress coerced the former Confederate states into ratifying the 14th Amendment. And I think that is not the right way of looking at it. So you could say that about the 13th Amendment, right? Look at the legislatures that ratified the 13th Amendment. They look a lot like the legislatures that voted to secede in 1861. They're all white, they're Democrats, that's the same state. The legislatures that ratify the 14th Amendment are very different. They are racially integrated, they are Republican. And the legislatures that ratify the 13th Amendment maybe don't want to, right? There's some arm twisting going on there. The legislatures that ratify the 14th Amendment are happy to. They are not being coerced. Those people are pro-equality, racially integrated Republicans. So I would say the states are not being coerced, right? What happened was when founding America said no to the 14th Amendment, Congress destroyed 10 of the states that said no, and it made new ones that would say yes. So when new states ratify this new Constitution, what do you get? I say you get a new nation. So how should we think about Reconstruction and like the Declaration of Independence? Well, if there's one thing that the founding America would have been upset about, I think it is Congress annihilating states. So dissolving our legislatures, that's actually one of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence, this bad thing King George did. What else is depriving us of trial by jury, rendering the military superior to the civil power, emancipating our slaves? All of those are complaints in the Declaration of Independence. All of those are things the Reconstruction Congress did. And King George never went nearly as far, actually, as the Reconstruction Congress. So if Reconstruction is a second founding, which I kind of think it is, it's not at all like the first founding. It is not consent of the governed. It is not a people defining itself. It is a political community and a political structure imposed from above. In the name, I say, of justice and democracy, but that's a different story. But it is a regime change revolution from above. So the short takeaway, my argument is American history is not a story of continuity. It's a story of failure and reinvention. The Constitution that was written in 1787 has not served us well for over 200 years, as we sometimes like to say. It lasted about 80, and it failed. And as I said before, we are not the heirs of founding America. We are the heirs of the people who destroyed it. So why is this a better story? I'm going to take just a couple minutes. One general point, if you're saying that the patriots of 1776 are your heroes and the people that you should emulate, what are you telling people to do? Read the Declaration of Independence and you will see they're focusing kind of obsessively on injustices they think have been inflicted against them. And honestly, American 1776 is not a wildly oppressed society if you're a white man. They're focusing on injustices they think have been inflicted against them, and they're ignoring the injustices they inflict on other people, right? Because they are literally enslaving 500,000 people. What might be a better model? Maybe the US Army of 1865, which is fighting to bring freedom to others, which is looking for injustice that doesn't affect them and trying to make the world a better place. And a particular way that this echoes into the present day, what do we think about white paramilitaries fighting the national government? Well, if you're telling the standard story, so this is why I think the Declaration of Independence is bad to rely on now. I'm not saying it's been bad in the past, although I have some interesting things to say about that. What I'm saying is we should pivot away, right? And why should we pivot away? Because what do you want to say about white paramilitaries fighting the national government? Well, with the standard story, those are the good guys, right? They're the Sons of Liberty and the Minutemen, and they are the good guys, even if what they're doing is technically insurrection or treason, because they're fighting the oppressors. If you focus on Reconstruction as our founding moment, they are the bad guys. They are the people who end up overthrowing Reconstruction. They are the red shirts, the White League, the Ku Klux Klan. They fight the federal army, and they're mostly defeated. Federal army stands down. They overthrow Reconstruction, right? They are the bad guys. So we should judge stories, I say, based in part on truth, but based in part on utility. So the big question would be, what do you want to say now about white paramilitaries fighting the national government? Because they're out there, right? They are the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters. And they were there at the Capitol on January 6th, flying Revolutionary War flags and flying the Confederate flag alongside it, because one of my points is there's a lot more that the founding and the Confederacy have in common than we like to admit. And I think we want a story that says those are the bad guys. So that's the specific better angle that I think you get from this story. And I want to have time for discussion, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. That's great. Hello. Hey, thanks for bearing with us, everyone. Asma Udin, you're up.
Okay, great. Well, my apologies for not being there in person and then having to put you guys all through this sort of ordeal. But I really wanted to be there. Can you hear me clearly?
We're just getting a little bit of feedback. Is there?
Oh.
I think yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's much better. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Again, for having me here today. So, as Professor Roosevelt argues in his thought-provoking work, the standard story of American progress is incomplete at best and deeply misleading at worst. While his critique focuses primarily on the struggle for racial equality, I believe his insights hold profound implications for how we understand the history of religious freedom in the United States. We take comfort in our origins. And the narrative begins with the colonization of America, European groups, including the Pilgrims, Puritans, Quakers, and others. These groups fled religious persecution in Europe and sought refuge in the New World, where they hoped to establish communities based on their own religious beliefs and practices. So the American experiment in this view represented a major departure from the religious strife and the state-sponsored religion that had plagued the old world. And in contrast, America was seen as a place where individuals of diverse religious backgrounds could coexist peacefully and practice their faith freely. And yes, there were early legal precedents that support this narrative. You see Thomas Jefferson and James Madison played significant roles in advocating for religious freedom. Jefferson famously wrote in his Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion. This sentiment was echoed in the debates surrounding the drafting of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment explicitly protects the freedom of religion by prohibiting the establishment of a state religion and guaranteeing the free exercise of it. But the idealized narrative is contested in multiple ways. For one, the standard story of America's founding often portrays the country's origins as deeply intertwined with Christian beliefs and principles. This perspective emphasizes the religious motivations of the early European settlers who sought religious freedom and viewed America as a city upon a hill or a beacon of Christian civilization. Some proponents of this view highlight references to God in founding documents, such as the Declaration of Independence, and argue that the founding fathers were predominantly Christian and intended for Christianity to play a central role in the nation's development. But critics argue that these examples don't tell the whole story. For example, the Declaration of Independence, while mentioning God, is primarily a secular document that lays out a political philosophy based on Enlightenment ideas of natural rights and popular sovereignty. Its references to the divine are more deistic than explicitly Christian, reflecting the broader intellectual currents of the time. And yet, there is a troubling rise of Christian nationalism in American politics, and has implications for the rights and freedoms of religious minorities and non-believers. This ideology, which asserts that the United States was founded as an explicitly Christian nation and should be governed according to narrow interpretations of Christian doctrine, seeks to privilege a particular brand of conservative Christianity at the expense of true religious pluralism. One disturbing sign of this worldview is the push by some Christian nationalist groups for immigration policies that blatantly favor Christians over adherents of other faiths. They argue that the U.S. should prioritize refugees and immigrants from Christian-majority countries while severely restricting or even banning entry for Muslim-majority nations. This discriminatory approach not only flies in the face of America's commitment to religious neutrality in immigration, but also reinforces dangerous stereotypes that paint Islam as inherently incompatible with American values. Christian nationalists have also been at the forefront of efforts to inject sectarian religious practices into public schools and other government institutions, from mandatory prayer in classrooms to Bible classes that promote a particular theological viewpoint. These initiatives serve to alienate and marginalize students who come from minority faith backgrounds or who hold non-religious beliefs. What's especially insidious about these Christian nationalist campaigns is that they're often cloaked in the language of religious freedom, even as they actively undermine that very principle. By seeking special privileges and accommodations for their own religious practices while denying equal consideration to others, they warp the meaning of the First Amendment into a tool for religious supremacy rather than a bulwark against state favoritism. So the idealized narrative of America's founding as a beacon of religious freedom is also complicated in other ways, right? Sometimes it leads to historical revisionism or whitewashing of past injustices. We omit from our mainstream narratives the history of persecution against indigenous religious practices and the forced assimilation of Native American children in boarding schools. Textbooks and popular media have often portrayed the European colonizers and settlers as peaceful pioneers seeking religious freedom and coexisting harmoniously with indigenous peoples. The establishment of mission schools and other institutions aimed at, quote, civilizing Native Americans is sometimes presented as benevolent or educational efforts. But this narrative frequently omits the violence that was involved. Mission schools often aimed at eradicating Native cultures, languages, and religions through forced conversion to Christianity and European customs. The traumatic impacts of these policies on indigenous communities are often understated or ignored. Even today, Native American religions continue to suffer grievous violations of their religious liberty, as sacred lands and practices are trampled by corporate and government interests. In fact, just a few weeks ago, in a devastating blow to the Apache people, a federal appellate court declined to protect Oak Flat from being swallowed up by a massive copper mine. For centuries, its ancient forests in Arizona has been the holy place for Western Apache tribes, who gather there to perform essential religious ceremonies. The court's ruling allows Resolution Copper, which is a foreign-owned mining company, to move forward with their destructive plan to literally create a crater in this consecrated ground. Apaches view this as a deplorable desecration. It's equivalent to dynamiting the Vatican or flooding Jerusalem. Yet the court determined that since Apaches can still access Oak Flat for now, not in the long term, but for now, their religious freedom is sufficiently protected, even though the entire site will soon be obliterated. It's a haunting echo of how American law has so often failed to safeguard Native religions. Contrast this with the much more expansive religious liberty protections often afforded to Western faiths. When Christian churches challenged pandemic restrictions on indoor gatherings, the Supreme Court agreed that this burdened their religious exercise and blocked the rules. But when Apaches object to their sacred land being outright destroyed, the courts find that there is no substantial burden on their free exercise of religion. This uneven legal landscape sends a chilling message that some religions, namely those practicing outside the mainstream, are less worthy of protection. Until our laws and courts correct these profound disparities, America's promise of religious liberty will remain painfully unfulfilled for Native peoples. The heartbreaking saga of Oak Flat is just the latest chapter in this shameful legacy. And the Native Americans aren't our only sad story of religious persecution. Throughout American history, other religious minorities have faced harrowing oppression and discrimination. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as waves of immigrants sought refuge on America's shores, Catholics and Jews found themselves in the crosshairs of a ferocious backlash. Catholic churches, schools, and convents were assaulted by raging mobs. Catholic workers were denied jobs and shunned by society. The specter of Catholic indoctrination loomed large in the Protestant imagination, sparking fierce opposition to any public funding for parochial schools. It was a battle for the very soul of American education. Jews, too, endured an unrelenting onslaught of violence and vitriol. Synagogues were desecrated, businesses vandalized, and lives shattered by acts of anti-Semitic terror. And for Mormons, the hope of building a new Zion in the West quickly turned to ashes. Mainstream Christians denounced the LDS Church as a dangerous cult, its followers as heretics to be reviled and expelled. Vigilante mobs laid waste to Mormon settlements across the frontier, while politicians and preachers alike called for their extermination. In 1838, the governor of Missouri issued an executive order declaring the Mormons, quote, must be treated as enemies and driven from the state or face a genocidal reckoning. Hundreds were slaughtered and thousands more fled for their lives. A century later, in the crucible of the civil rights movement, Black churches became targets of a terrifying campaign of racist terror. Across the South, houses of worship were firebombed and torched, reduced to rubble and ashes by white supremacists determined to crush the spirit of African American resistance. And in our own times, American Muslims have been caught in the maw of a rising tide of Islamophobia, stoked by cynical political leaders and media demagogues. Mosques have been vandalized and set ablaze. Hijab-wearing women have been insulted and assaulted on the streets. The Trump administration's Muslim ban sent a devastating message that Muslims were not welcome in the land of the free. In workplaces across the nation, Muslims have been denied jobs, harassed by colleagues, and fired for the simple act of practicing their faith. Studies paint a grim picture of entrenched bias. A Muslim name on a resume is a red flag for many employers, consigning countless qualified candidates to the unemployment line. The religious hypocrisy also shows up in court. A June 2023 study found that Trump-appointed judges overwhelmingly voted in favor of religion, but only when the claimant was Christian or Jewish. When it came to cases involving Islam, Trump judges voted in favor of Muslim plaintiffs in only 19.2% of the cases, compared with 34.5% for non-Trump Republicans and 48% for Democrats. So this troubling history of religious favoritism serves as a sobering reminder that America still has a lot of work to do in fulfilling its founding ideals of religious liberty and equal treatment under the law. If we are serious about building a society of true inclusion and mutual respect, we must reckon honestly with this painful legacy. It's not enough to celebrate religious freedom in the abstract. We have to grapple with the many ways that freedom has been denied or curtailed for specific groups throughout our history. So now Professor Roosevelt notes that the standard story lulls us into complacency, telling us that discrimination is merely the work of a few bad apples. But all we need to do is be kind and trust in America's inevitable march toward justice. But the hard truth is that isolated acts of tolerance and goodwill, while valuable, are not enough to dismantle entrenched structures of inequality. What we need is nothing less than a fundamental reimagining of our legal and cultural frameworks to uphold the dignity and worth of every tradition. We must become, in Professor Roosevelt's words, heroes of the better story. Those who recognize that changing this broken system is our shared responsibility, even if we benefit from the status quo. Like the leaders of Reconstruction who turned a war for union into a war for freedom, we must be willing to challenge the comfortable narratives and fight for a more expansive vision of religious liberty. This revolution begins with reforms to fortify protections for religious minorities. We need to strengthen our religious freedom laws, close loopholes that allow for faith-based discrimination, and crack down on hate crimes and bias incidents. And we have to appoint judges who understand the vital importance of safeguarding the free exercise of all faiths and not just the dominant ones. And laws are not enough. We also have to strive to transform hearts and minds, which means investing in educational initiatives that promote interfaith understanding. And it means creating more opportunities for meaningful dialogue and collaboration across faith communities. Our evolving story of inclusive equality, rooted in the transformative era of Reconstruction, has made significant strides towards realizing the revolutionary vision of genuine religious freedom for all. Landmark civil rights legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Fair Housing Act has enshrined powerful protections against religious discrimination in key areas of public life. And the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and its state-level counterparts have fortified the right to practice one's faith free from undue government interference. And through groundbreaking decisions, the courts have affirmed and expanded constitutional safeguards for religious liberty. Yet for all this progress, the struggle for true religious equality remains unfinished. Even as the legal landscape has shifted in favor of more robust protections, there are still troubling disparities and inconsistencies. The Supreme Court jurisprudence has sparked contentious debate on whether its expansive view of religious freedom privileges the beliefs of conservative Christians at the expense of other faith communities and marginalized groups. These developments raised unsettling questions that cut to the heart of our constitutional commitments. How can we ensure that religious freedom laws and court decisions protect not only the majority faiths, but also unpopular and minority communities? In pluralistic society, how do we craft legal frameworks that allow diverse religious groups to live out their beliefs authentically? And when the free exercise of religion collides with other fundamental rights, like non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ individuals, how do we strike a just and equitable balance? Even as we grapple with complex issues around religious liberty, we cannot ignore the ongoing tensions between protecting free exercise and upholding other constitutionally protected rights. The recent uproar over Montgomery County Public Schools' revised elementary curriculum, which aims to promote LGBTQ inclusivity, underscores these dilemmas. While some parents object on religious grounds, others view the curriculum as crucial for creating an affirmative learning environment for all students. The contentious school meetings with parents passionately voicing concerns that the new lessons contradict their religious teachings on gender and sexuality highlight how even curricula designed to create an inclusive environment can become a flashpoint. Reaching a resolution that respects the rights of LGBT students while also accommodating the deeply held beliefs of religious minorities will require nuanced policymaking and a commitment to sincere dialogue from all sides. So these are the thorny but essential questions that we have to keep answering as our national story unfolds. As Professor Roosevelt reminds us, building a more perfect union is not about nostalgic appeals to a mythical past, but rather a relentless push to expand the circle of inclusion and belonging. We have to build an America that truly embodies its highest ideal, an America where religious diversity is celebrated as a source of strength, and where every person can pursue their spiritual truth with authenticity and without constraint. The future of religious freedom is ours to shape, and the story of America is still being written. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both very much. That's great. All right, hopefully you can hear well enough to engage. Let's flip to you, friends. We're going to break for lunch at 12:15, so let's go strong between now and then. Who's up? Please. Hi. Tyler Whetstone. Wonderful.
Thank you, guys. Thank you both. I wanted to talk just as someone who is in a local newsroom in the South, what it looks like to confront the January 6th type of politician, or because a lot of times they are politicians or they're just regular folk who use this aggrieved white male syndrome is what I would consider it, that you see when you're talking about the revolution or the in Reconstruction time. How do you push back on that while also reporting on your community? It is your community, so how do you reconcile that?
I think that's a very difficult question. So, depending on the position that you're in, you would address it in different ways, I guess. And I'm not sure that I have a lot of good advice for how to do that as a reporter. What I'm trying to do as sort of a constitutional historian and shaper of American narratives or suggester of American narratives is to try to give us a narrative that doesn't center the aggrieved white male as the hero. Because I think that the revolution really does that to a substantial extent. That's what I was saying. The theory of the revolution is I'm being oppressed. I will decide if your violation of my rights is sufficient to justify revolution, because no one else can judge that, right? How do you decide? Locke says this. We make an appeal to heaven, right? There can be no earthly judge of the rightness of our cause. Jefferson says that. He says, appealing to, what is it, the universal judge or something for the rectitude of our cause or something. And the patriots put an appeal to heaven on a flag. They restore Locke's phrasing, it's the pine tree flag. January 6th, that flag is flying at the Capitol. And part of what I'm saying is if you have Reconstruction as your birth of America and your model, the aggrieved white man is not at the center of the story anymore. The aggrieved white man is kind of the antagonist. And the idea is more like, hey, come on, we're all in this together. America is worth fighting for. Maybe you have to make some sacrifices for other people, right? And that's what a good American does. A good American doesn't necessarily insist on their own rights. A good American insists on making the world a better place.
Osman, you want to weigh in on that too, or are you happy?
Oh, sorry. No, I agree exactly about that. I think right now, some of the tensions that we're dealing with in terms of the public conversation around the privileging of majority religions over minority religions is exactly, it's often undergirded also by a lot of activism, pushing forward Christian claims in courts. And the conversation tends to just focus on that aggrieved. Professor Roosevelt's kind of talking about the aggrieved white man, but a lot of our conversation right now tends to be about the aggrieved white Christian or white conservative Christian, which I don't attack those claims, but it's also oftentimes it overshadows the claims of other religious minorities and the ways that those might be in conflict.
That's great. Okay. Jolly from Deseret News.
Yeah. Sorry. we just talked about ideal America, good America. It seems like when we talk about what the country was founded on, we had different priorities. We were trying to detach from the British. As you said, we were trying to challenge the status quo. But current modern America is the world superpower, right? And I guess it seems like when we go into wars in present America, we lean on ideals like protecting democracy and being a patriot, right? But what can we, as we look back at the history and what the founders wanted and all these discussions we're having, what can we learn from history to try to understand the narrative that modern America uses when we're talking about its relationship with the outside world, with other countries, with war, basically, and what as journalists should think about when we write about these things and report about these things?
I think that's a great question, and it kind of connects to Tyler's question, which I think maybe I have a slightly better answer to, which is an answer to yours too, which is I think it's really important to try to bring in multiple perspectives. Because one of the things that happens a whole lot, and this is sort of important for the way that we think about religion and religion in the public sphere, is things that are familiar to people are invisible. So there's like this story about the old fish and the young fish, and the old fish is like, hey, the water is nice today, and the young fish is like, what's water? Because it's all around you all the time, you don't see it. And a lot of Americans are like that with whiteness or with Christianity, because that's sort of like what surrounds you all the time, it's normalized. You're like, that's the default. Another way of putting this, sort of, I think, is that if you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression. So the aggrieved white male, the aggrieved Christian, like these people aren't wrong to think that things are changing or that things are being taken from them. What they are missing is what it looks like for other people. And I think you got the same thing with America in the world, where Americans often think of themselves as like the Rebel Alliance in Star Wars, and everyone else understands we're the empire on the international stage. Like we are the big, scary military force. But we just sort of don't think about that. And you see this very vividly, I think, in terms of the lack of concern for the lives of foreigners that we show. So if you're talking about counterterrorism operations, and we're like, how much do we care about civilian casualties from our drone strikes when we get the wrong guy? And for a long time, we were like, that could be Osama bin Laden, and it turns out to be a wedding party. And we just kill dozens of innocent people. We really need to do a better job of understanding how that comes across, because the way that it comes across a lot is Americans are indifferent to the lives of people living in other countries. Maybe we should make them feel it themselves. Like, what does it feel like when suddenly people in your country are killed for no reason? It makes us less safe that we inspire people to try to bring that lesson home to us. And if we understood that lesson on our own, we wouldn't have that risk.
So Asma, that question may not have gotten to you, was about sort of how does the first and second version of the story, Reconstruction, a better story, animate the way that we prosecute and advance values in a time of war around the world? Touch that one a little bit. Should we go to Leah?
Well, I mean, without getting into too many details, I think right now there's a lot going on in international stakes. They're going to raise what America's ability human rights. And that question has come up in the past in lesser or more degrees. But I think that there's such a sort of the mantra that we are sort of protective of civil liberties. It's something that we often sort of project confidently without realizing a lot of people are seeing us as hypocritical and not living up to what we profess we believe.
Great. Leah from NPR.
Hi. My question is about how we reconcile kind of civil values with religious values, especially when they're in contrast, as you brought up. And if you have seen any examples of times when something that was like felt like a fundamental difference between two religious groups or between kind of our civil values and religious values was reconciled in a way that felt actually productive and meaningful to all of the parties that were involved.
I have seen productive examples. I mean, there is current legislation that shows a willingness for both sides to come together and to figure out a solution, a compromise with each other. So I think talking about the youth legislation called the Youth, which provides for broad LGBTQ rights in housing and employment, but also has exemptions or like carve-outs for specific religious objections to same-sex marriage. We have the Respect for Marriage Act that essentially is sort of like a federal version of that. And beyond sort of legislation, just the conversations that I've been able to be a part of, and oftentimes very contentious, and there are lots and lots of people who don't want to come to the table. But I myself have seen sort of the two groups come and sit around a round table and actually take each other's concerns seriously and try to craft other sorts of compromises, other sorts of sort of like, what does this look like in our everyday lives? What does it look like at the local level with Montgomery County? Unfortunately, a lot of these tend to be contentious, and the Montgomery County issue is something that at various points has been very contentious, but it's an ongoing conversation. And the only thing that I can hope for, particularly as somebody who advocates for religious liberty, is to make sure that the religious liberty concerns also don't get lost in this, because sometimes that tends to happen. And to just make sure that there's a realization that both interests are very important and that they're taken seriously.
Touch that one, Kermit. Faith Pinho with the Los Angeles.
Yeah, so I think it's a really hard question. And we've got these two different constitutional provisions, the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause, that are kind of pointing in different directions. Overall, what I would say is a guiding principle should be equality. So if you're going to give religions exemptions, you should do that for all religions. And when does this work? I think it works okay if you're just talking about sort of speech or religious belief. And it works better if it's confined to the private sphere. But then you get harder questions where we're concerned about conduct. And what we're saying is this religiously motivated conduct is contrary to some secular value. It's a pretty hard question, but maybe like the right answer is go for religious liberty if it's something someone's doing to themselves. It's a harder question, I think, if they're doing it to co-religionists and the secular authorities are like, we think what you're doing is bad for children. We think what you're doing is bad for women inside your religion. And then I think it's maybe easier, and I would probably go the other way, if you're talking about outsiders, right? People who don't share your faith. You're like, we must treat you in a certain way because of our faith. I think like you can do that in the private sphere. I'm much less willing to say you can do that in the public sphere. But you got to try to draw these lines. And I think sometimes you can come up with an answer that makes sense. Sometimes you can come up with an answer where really everyone should be happy. If you're just talking about free speech and letting 1,000 flowers bloom, sometimes you can do that. Sometimes I think you have to choose, and then I would be looking at like, is it private, is it public, is it the individual, is it a co-religionist, is it an outsider? But it's hard.
Clarify, I mean, even as I state that there should be robust protections for religious liberty, but I'm also working within the legal framework, which I do accept as valid, and as providing really broad protections. And so the existing legal framework does, in many cases, require that the court, that the government, in order to limit religious freedom, has to sort of demonstrate that the government has a compelling government interest, right? And so it's not all the case, it's not all the time that religious liberty is going to be protected, but there are important sort of parameters and a framework for it. And, in terms of the inter-religious issue or religious people and third parties, I agree that the conversation is different, but oftentimes the way to sort of draw the line isn't so much the inter, but it's also the question of whether or not there's government coercion involved. So when it's, maybe some sort of traditional practices that people see as oppressive or restrictive, but ultimately the approach to that, because the government is not a party, is to sort of allow for space for the community to be able to determine their own parameters, and for outsiders and those who object to persuade them, as opposed to sort of punishing them with religious restrictions. But even in that context, it has something to do with, for example, physical well-being, or, for example, Jehovah's, a classic example are Jehovah's Witnesses who might deny a life-saving blood transfusion for their children. Those sorts of extreme cases where safety and well-being are at issue is where the courts can come in and limit religious liberty.
Yeah, I would say one addendum on the religion side. You can ask: is a person who doubles down on their own religious tradition more or less able to reach across the aisle and reach across to people of different point of view in a way that is open and constructive, that can lead to the expansion of both rights or not? I think that's an interesting conversation, because you might say it makes you know your own tribe, and you're going to be all about the inward posture. But you might say, actually, it gives you a secure base from which to freely go explore and be open to a sit down with an LGBTQ, conversation around the Respect for Marriage Act. So I think that's a big question in the religion space: is what allows thick pluralism versus what restricts it, and as part of the story too. Okay, let's get 2 more questions, and then we'll break for lunch. Next up is Faith Pinho from the Los Angeles Times.
Hi. Thank you also, Josh, for handling all of the tech and everyone. I think my question is kind of a 2-part. So I'm trying to draw parallels between both of your talks, and I guess I'm wondering, am I going too far in concluding that, if the 1860s is the turning point in America and where we should actually be pinning our heroic origin story, I guess, or pivoting it from the white paramilitary coming into power and making it much more pluralist. And then now we see kind of the rising awareness of Christian nationalism and a sort of turning around that and becoming more, protecting more religious liberty for minority religions. So I guess my first question is, are you drawing that parallel? Are we in sort of the second Civil War, maybe a holy Civil War moment right now? And then kind of off of that, I guess I'm wondering, we're also seeing declining religiosity in America, right? By leaps and bounds in the last couple decades. So what is the role of, or impact of religious apathy and the role of the religious nuns in this really tense moment? Thanks.
Great question.
Should I start?
Either way, yep. Asma, Dr. Roosevelt, you want to start? Go, Dr. Roosevelt, please.
Okay, I mean, I honestly think Asma probably has a better answer to that question. So I'm going to give you sort of more my perspective about the moment that we're in. The moment that we're in now is the second redemption. So I give you this happy story about Reconstruction. Here are the great ideals of Reconstruction. I don't really talk about what happens after that. But what happens after that is the former Confederates don't accept it. And to maintain the Reconstruction governments, the United States has to fight basically a counterinsurgency war. And eventually we stop, the Reconstruction governments are overthrown, that's redemption. And then the promise of Reconstruction is submerged for about 100 years until the Civil Rights Movement, which, it's true, talks about the Declaration of Independence, but is trying to enforce the Reconstruction Amendments and is called by historians the Second Reconstruction. And then, I think, beginning about 1980, we get a backlash to the Civil Rights Movement, a backlash to the Second Reconstruction, which is the Second Redemption, right? So the first redemption is the overthrow of the first Reconstruction. Second redemption is a backlash to the Second Reconstruction. That's the historical moment that we're in now, according to my account.
Beautiful, great. Maybe a quick response, Asma, as well?
Yeah, so on the question of the impact of the role of declining religiosity, yes, there are serious challenges that are posed by that. Especially as religious liberty becomes increasingly contentious and debated, and it's, in large part because of the types of claims that are being brought to court. there's just a difficulty for a lot of Americans to understand religion. I mean, in specifically traditional religion, and this idea of religion imposing duties on people. Often in the public square, there's a lot of rhetoric that like, well, if they don't want to provide contraception or if they don't want to perform abortion, then they should just not choose that job. They should choose some other job, right? As opposed to sort of like understanding like how religious people can and should be, play a robust role in the public space, be able to do the thing, like sort of engage in the employment that they want to engage in, and how those rights to express religion in the public square are, in many cases, not all cases, but in a lot of cases are protected by our law and our understanding of religious freedom. But that is a sort of type of rhetoric, the kind of like minimizing of who people are religiously, what that means for them in their public space. So this idea of like something not being obligatory on them when in fact they feel it as an obligation and as a duty in order for them to fulfill what is right in their religion. So I think that with declining religiosity, it's also just a declining sort of understanding of what religion is, the types of constraints and obligations that it imposes on religious believers. And so it definitely raises religious freedom questions in that way. What I've read is that a lot of sort of declining religiosity has to do with just sort of this, disenchantment with the way that religion has become politicized. Whether it be, politicians or court decisions, there's just a sense that religion is aligned with things that we don't like, whether it be bigotry and hatred or narrow-mindedness and so on. And so for me, really, when my second book called The Politics of Vulnerability, and a lot of my sort of legal research from there has been focused on how do we depoliticize religious liberty? Like, what are the ways to kind of begin to sever this connection between religion and politics? Because ultimately, I think that is what's driving the apathy, and that is what's driving a lot of sort of the cynicism and dismissiveness against religious claims.
Great. All right, just to orient us, we got one more. Let's do it. We'll have basically from here, we'll break. We'll go to lunch. We'll resume for an hour at 1:30, take a 15-minute coffee break, resume for one more push at 2:45 for an hour, and then we'll break for the rest of the afternoon, time to file stories and freshen up and the like, and then there will be a reception about 4 blocks from here during the dinner hour with a bunch of great people. So that's what's on deck. Let's get one more question from Reese Gorman, Daily Beast.
I'm just wondering kind of what led to this rise in kind of religious extremism that we're seeing, whether it be Christian nationalism or whatever, or kind of what's happening at Columbia right now with the anti-Semitic protests that we've seen going on throughout the country. How do we get to this point to where like this is the way people kind of talk and kind of express their beliefs, where it's not listening to other people and that it's I'm right, you're wrong, and we're going to go to the extreme of anything, as opposed to just sitting there listening and trying to have some sort of disagreement on a more kind of level that's more cordial and all that.
I think that's a great question. I'm going to try to answer really quickly. My first answer is I don't know. But my second answer is if I had to guess, I think like social media and the internet has a fair amount to do with it, because it's a lot easier to surround yourself with sources that only confirm your pre-existing beliefs. And I think that tends to make people more extreme. And I think the experience of interacting online where you don't actually see someone, you don't necessarily see them as a real person, also makes people extreme. And that has maybe carried over a bit into real life.
Yeah, so why we're about to go to lunch, but why are we so polarized and coming apart at the seams?
Well, that's a huge question, and one that I spent a lot of time thinking about. But just briefly, I think social media and sort of the echo chambers has a huge role. A lot of times, sort of people sort of working in the space say that we've experienced a moralization of the discourse. So as before, we might disagree with each other and just say, well, you're wrong, and I don't think that's correct. Now it's actually you're evil if you hold a different position. And I think that's, of course, interlinked with the social media and sort of like the informational environments that we exist in. Another concept that I often sort of draw on is this idea of mega identities, so that our partisan identities now are not limited to policy issues, but have expanded to include race and religion and sexuality and what we eat and where we live and what we drive. These are all sort of like, I mean, there are studies that have found that it's mostly liberals who eat sushi, for example, and it's, you know, mostly liberals who drive hybrids, but they're mostly Republicans who drive Land Rovers, and things like that. And so it's expanded so much that we are able to sort of become more and more divided depending on an ever-expanding sort of scope of traits. And finally, I do think that, you know, there is a connection between, I mean, we've seen it in the reporting recently in terms of sort of the recent conflicts, but just the type of sort of identity politics and skewed understandings of intersectionality that have created these sort of ideas of like oppressed versus oppressor. That because there's such a stark sort of black and white distinction between these two sets of groups, it's often hard for us to understand when that narrative might actually be complicated in a given conflict.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both very much. This was very rich. Appreciate it. Thank you.